The North Field never drained right after heavy rain. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Earl Dawson had known this since boyhood, following his father through the October mud on a Saturday morning, watching the older man steer their tractor around the soft spots near the hickory line without ever explaining why. Some things on a farm you learn by watching, not by asking. The ground up there sat wrong. It always had. Soft in places it had no business being soft. Slow to warm in spring when the rest of the fields were already workable. His father used to say the dirt in the North Field had a different memory than the rest of the land, and Earl had spent 40 years turning that phrase over in his mind without ever deciding what it meant. He was 58 years old now. He still didn't know. The morning of October 14th started the way his mornings had started for 30 years, before 5, before light, boots on before the kitchen light was fully warm. He'd been setting his alarm for 4:47 since Margaret was alive, back when waking early was something they did together, when the quiet house still held two people moving through it instead of one. She would sleep through the alarm, through the rooster, through most of what the world demanded of her in the early hours. He used to find that funny. Now the silence on her side of the bed was just silence, and the alarm went off into an empty room. The coffee maker finished its cycle before he got his second boot tied. He stood at the kitchen window while it brewed, looking out at the dark yard. The barn light was on, the one that stayed on all night on a timer, and it threw a pale yellow circle across the gravel. Beyond that was the dark of the fields, spreading out in every direction as far as the property ran. 340 acres of Kentucky bottomland that had been in the Dawson family since 1891, when Earl's great-grandfather Thomas had bought the original 200-acre parcel from a man named Horace Bledsoe for $1,100 and a sorrel mare. Thomas Dawson had been 26 years old when he made that purchase. He'd worked 3 harvests for Bledsoe before he had enough saved to make an offer, doing it all with a handshake and a written receipt that Earl still kept in a cedar box on the closet shelf. That receipt was the oldest thing in the house. Some days it felt like the most important thing in the house, a piece of paper that said this land is ours, and we earned it. Thomas had built the original farmhouse by himself over one winter, a 2-room structure that had been added onto 4 times across 4 generations until it became the 14-room house Earl now rattled around in alone. He poured his coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. There was a letter on the table. There had been a letter on the table for 5 days, and every morning he sat down with his coffee and looked at it, and then looked away. It was from First Agricultural Bank of Hardin County, and it didn't say anything he hadn't already known, but seeing it in writing made the knowing feel different. He was 11 months behind on the operating loan he'd taken out the year after Margaret died. The drought of the previous summer had taken most of what would have covered that payment, and then the following winter had been hard on the equipment, and then one of those things had led to another the way things do on a working farm. And now the letter sat on the table, saying things in polite legal language that amounted to the same thing his daughter Claire had been saying on the phone for 6 months. You have to think about selling, Dad. Claire lived in Nashville now. She'd gone there for college and stayed for a marketing job and built a life for herself with her husband Daniel and their 2 kids, and Earl was proud of her for all of it. He was. But she'd grown up on this land, and then she'd left it, and when she looked at the farm now she saw a burden instead of a birthright. She saw money that could be freed up, debt that could be erased, a father who was getting older and working too hard alone on land that might be better served by someone else. She wasn't wrong about the math. Earl understood the math. The farm had been losing ground for 3 years, first the drought, then the prices, then the equipment failures that seemed to multiply every season. He'd let go of the 2 part-time hands he'd kept on for years because he couldn't justify the wages. He was doing everything himself now, which meant things were being done slower, and some things weren't getting done at all. The fencing along the east pasture had needed replacing for 2 seasons. The roof of the equipment shed had a section he'd been patching with sheet metal and a prayer. The truck needed a new fuel pump that he kept putting off because the truck still ran, just not well. The letter from the bank gave him 60 days. He read it again that morning, the 5th morning, the way you read something hoping the words have changed. They hadn't. He set it back on the table and drank his coffee and watched the sky begin to lighten through the kitchen window, the dark fading out to a gray blue that meant cold and clear. A good working day. The kind of day you didn't waste sitting at a kitchen table. He had decided the week before that he would plow the north field for a winter cover crop. It was the one piece of the farm he hadn't touched in 2 seasons, partly because it had never been his best ground, and partly because something about working it had always felt like more effort than the return justified. His father had kept it in hay most years, cut it twice in a good summer, and called it done. His grandfather had apparently grown tobacco there in the 1950s and abandoned it. For reasons no one alive could remember. The field had a reputation in the family for being difficult, without anyone ever pinning down exactly why. But Earl needed the ground producing. He needed everything producing. He couldn't afford a field sitting idle when he was 60 days from the bank coming to have a different kind of conversation with him. He finished the coffee, washed the cup, and left the letter on the table. He told himself he'd deal with it this afternoon. He'd been telling himself that for 5 days. Outside, the cold hit him the way October cold hits when the summer warmth is finally, completely gone. Not the cold that flirts with you in September and retreats. This was the settled kind, the kind that meant the season had made up its mind. He could see his breath in the barn light as he crossed the gravel. The sky was going from gray-blue to a pale orange at the horizon, and the fields were still dark, just beginning to take shape into growing light. The John Deere 8R was in the equipment shed, already hitched to the 6-bottom plow he'd been running for 15 years. He'd serviced it 3 weeks ago, changed the oil, checked the hydraulics, greased every fitting he could reach. It was old equipment, but it was solid, the kind of machine that rewarded maintenance with reliability. He'd turned down 2 offers to trade it in over the years, and both times he'd been right to hold on to it. He climbed up into the cab, started the engine, let it warm for a few minutes while he looked out at the field. The north field was the furthest from the house, maybe half a mile up a gentle rise, and then over the crest where the property flattened out into a rectangle of ground that the old survey maps called the upper parcel. 62 acres. Bounded on the north side by a tree line of hickory and oak that Earl's great-grandfather had planted as a windbreak in the 1890s, on the east by the neighbor's fence, on the south by the dirt lane that bisected the property, on the west by a wet-weather creek that dried up most summers but ran hard in spring. He drove up the lane in the early morning light, the tractor's headlights sweeping across the field margins, the plow raised behind him. The lane was rough in places where the frost heave had worked at it over winters, and he knew every bump and dip the way you know something you've driven 1,000 times. At the top of the rise he stopped and let the engine idle. Below him, the north field spread out in the morning light, pale and still. The grass had gone brown with the cold. The soil was visible in patches where the grass was thin, dark Kentucky clay that should have been good ground by any measure but had never performed the way good ground should. He lowered the plow and started in. He worked from the western edge across toward the fence line, cutting long parallel passes through the soil. The ground was firm from the recent dry spell, not as hard as midsummer, but firm enough to work. The plow was turning good furrows, clean and even, and he watched them in the mirrors with the satisfaction a man gets from watching work go well. The smell of turned earth came through the cab vents, that raw particular smell that meant something was beginning. He'd always liked that smell. It was the smell of possibility, or at least of the part of possibility that came from work. He was on his 5th pass, maybe 30 yards from the eastern fence, when the ground gave way. It didn't announce itself. There was no warning crack, no preliminary settling. The front right wheel dropped suddenly and completely, like the earth beneath it had simply stopped existing, and the tractor lurched hard to the right with a violence that threw Earl sideways in the cab. He grabbed the steering wheel on instinct and hit the brakes, but the machine was already tilting, the weight of it pulling toward the hole that had opened beneath the right side. He could feel the whole rig wanting to go over. He killed the engine. The tractor groaned and shuddered, and then stopped moving, balanced at an angle that felt wrong in every way. The right front corner was down, the left rear was up, and the whole machine sat tilted at maybe 30 degrees, swaying slightly when he shifted his weight. Earl sat very still for a moment. His heart was going fast, and his hands were gripping the steering column hard enough to ache. Through the right side window, he could see that the ground had collapsed around the wheel, a rough circular opening, maybe 6 feet across, that the front corner of the tractor was now hanging into. Brown grass and black soil had fallen in around it. The rim of the hole had cracked outward in uneven lines from the pressure. He didn't look down. Not yet. He needed to get out of the cab first. He moved slowly, keeping his weight toward the high side of the tilted machine. The door on the left side swung open cleanly. He climbed down the steps and jumped the last 2 feet to solid ground, landing hard and stumbling, but staying on his feet. He backed away from the tractor immediately, not trusting the ground around the hole, watching the edges for any sign that more was going to go. The machine stayed where it was. The collapse had stopped. The edges of the hole looked stable, or at least they weren't spreading. Earl stood 10 feet from the tractor and caught his breath. His hands were still shaking. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular shock of the earth doing something you didn't expect from it. Something that violated the fundamental contract between a farmer and his ground. That what you walk on will hold you. He looked at the hole. From where he stood, he could see the tractor's right front while hanging into darkness. The hole around it was maybe 6 feet across at its widest. The edges were ragged, the soil crumbling slightly at the rim. Around the tractor's wheel he could see the underside of what looked like a layer of wooden planking, old and rotted through in the spot where the wheel had come down, with the soil packed above it for who knew how long. Whatever was beneath it had been covered over. Deliberately, it looked like, but with materials that had finally given out under the weight of the tractor and the right combination of conditions. He stood there for a long moment just looking at it. A sinkhole was his first thought, the way limestone country sometimes opened up without warning when underground water wore away the rock below. He'd heard of it happening to farmers east of here, near the cave country. But this wasn't cave country. He'd never heard of a sinkhole on this property. And then he noticed something that changed the thought entirely. The planking visible at the hole's edge wasn't just rotted wood and packed earth. In the gap where the tractor's wheel had broken through, in the space between the collapsed wood and whatever was below it, there was a faint rectangular shape. A frame. Stonework. Something that had been built. Earl walked toward the hole slowly, testing each step before he put his weight down. He got close enough to see the rim clearly, close enough to get down on one knee and look over the edge. Below the fallen planks, maybe 8 feet down, the darkness resolved itself just enough in the morning light to show him walls. Stone walls, dressed and fitted, running off in 2 directions from the point directly below him. The floor, or what he thought was the floor, was a further 3 or 4 feet below that. He was looking into a room. The tractor engine was off and the field was quiet, just the wind moving through the hickory trees at the north edge of the property, and somewhere far away a crow calling and calling. Earl Dawson knelt in the dirt at the edge of a hole in his own field and looked down into a space that should not have been there, that had no explanation that fit anything he knew about this land. And he felt a sensation he couldn't have named precisely. Not quite fear, not quite wonder, something between them that sat in his chest and made it hard to think clearly. He stood up. He walked back to the tractor and retrieved his phone from the cab, moving carefully on the tilted machine. He called Claire's number. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Dad, it's 6:30. I know." He paused. Something happened out in the north field. "Are you okay?" She was awake now, fully. "Earl, are you hurt?" "I'm fine." The tractor went through the ground. "Went through? What does that mean?" "There's a hole," he said. "About 6 feet across. The tractor's front wheel is in it. And there's something underneath." "Something like what?" He thought about how to say it and couldn't find a good way. "A room," he said. "Built room. Stone walls. Somebody built something under that field." The silence on the line lasted long enough that he checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Call someone," she said finally. "A geologist or somebody. Could be a sinkhole." "It's not a sinkhole." He'd seen sinkholes. This had walls. "Dad, I'll call you later." He hung up before she could say anything else. He stood in the cold morning air, the tractor at its wrong angle behind him, the hole in the ground to his right. He pulled his jacket tighter and thought about what he needed. He needed rope. He needed a flashlight. He had both in the barn. The walk back down the lane took 10 minutes. He went to the barn and took the work flashlight off its hook by the door, the heavy rubber-cased one he kept charged and ready. And then he found 50 feet of half-inch rope coiled on the peg rail. He thought for a moment and added his smaller headlamp, the one he wore on his forehead for night work, and then he went back up the lane. The tractor was exactly as he'd left it, tilted at its wrong angle, the hole open at its front right corner. He walked the edge of the hole carefully, testing the rim. The soil was stable. The collapse had been clean, confined to the area where the old planking had given way. The rest of the ground was solid. He found a stone anchor at the edge of the tractor's tire ruts, a chunk of limestone poking up from the soil that he'd steered around hundreds of times over the years, and he tied the rope around it with 2 half hitches. He pulled it hard. It held. He tossed the coil into the hole and listened to it fall and then go quiet. He looked down one more time before he went in. The rope hung straight and still in the opening. The flashlight beam cut down through the darkness and hit the stone floor maybe 11 feet below ground level. The walls were clean, not crumbling. They were built to last. He went in feet first, the rope between his hands, walking himself down the wall. Soil and small stones fell from the torn edges of the opening as he descended, pattering off his jacket and his hat. The air changed as he went down, warmer than the surface. Still, the particular stillness of enclosed space that's been shut away from the world for a very long time. His boots hit the floor, and he stood up. He turned on the headlamp, the bigger flashlight already in his right hand, and he looked around at what was there. The room was rectangular, roughly 20 feet wide, and perhaps 30 feet long, with a ceiling height of about 9 feet. The walls were limestone block, dry-laid without mortar, but so carefully fitted that there was barely a gap between them. The floor was packed earth, hard as concrete, with flat stones set into it at intervals that might have been intended as a path, or might have been structural. The ceiling was timber and earth, the wooden supports still holding where the tractor hadn't come through, old beams of oak or chestnut that had darkened to near black with age. The room smelled of cold stone and old air, a mineral smell with something else beneath it he couldn't identify. Not rot, not water damage. Something dry and sealed, the smell of a space that had been closed and held its contents intact. He swept the flashlight around the perimeter. 2 walls were bare stone. One wall held a wooden shelving unit, old and heavy, empty of anything but dust. The 4th wall, the wall directly opposite him, the far end of the rectangle, had a door in it. A proper door, wooden, with iron hardware, set in a frame that was still plumb and square. The kind of door you'd see in an old farmhouse, not in an underground room that nobody had apparently entered in a generation. It was closed, and beside the door, stacked against the wall in 2 loose rows, were crates. Earl moved toward them slowly, counting as he went. 8 crates visible, wooden, the slack kind with gaps between the boards. Each one was maybe 3 feet long, and 2 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. They sat on a low platform of timber that kept them off the floor, the way you'd store anything you wanted to keep dry and off the damp earth. He shone the light through the gaps in the slats of the nearest crate. Inside, through the gaps, he could see the shapes of glass. Bottles, he thought at first. Long-necked, dark glass, laid on their sides in rows. But the shape wasn't quite right for bottles. He moved the light around, and the glass caught it and gave it back as a dull amber gleam. He found a pry bar in his jacket pocket, the short one he kept there out of habit, and he worked the lid of the nearest crate up from one corner. The nails screamed as they pulled from old dry wood, a sound that seemed enormous in that closed underground space. He got the lid up and folded it back and shone the light directly inside. Jars. Glass jars with metal lids, sealed, laid in careful rows. He lifted one out. It was heavy, heavier than a jar that size should be if it held air. He turned it in the flashlight beam and saw that the contents were not liquid. Through the glass, dull and unmistakable, the contents caught the light as small, irregular discs. Coins. He stared at the jar for a long moment. Then he set it carefully on the floor and opened the next crate. More jars. The same weight, the same contents. He opened the lid of a jar and tipped one coin out into his palm, a gold disc the size of a quarter, with an eagle on one face and a date struck clearly into the metal, 1893. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Earl Dawson was a man who had spent his entire adult life farming ground that had never made him rich, never made him comfortable, only kept him going from one season to the next with enough margin to believe the next season would be better. He had buried his wife from that farm. He had nearly lost it 3 times to drought or debt, or both combined. He had refused offers from developers twice and from neighbors once, and had held on to 340 acres through 30 years of hard seasons because it was his father's land and his grandfather's land and his great-grandfather's land, and he believed in ways he couldn't always articulate that the land was what kept the family real. He was crouching in the bottom of an underground room with a gold coin from 1893 in his palm and 8 crates of what appeared to be more of the same behind him, and there was a door in the far wall that he hadn't opened yet. He closed his hand around the coin. He sat back against the cold stone wall and looked up through the hole above him, the ragged opening where the tractor's wheel had punched through the century-old timber ceiling. He could see a piece of pale October sky through the opening, a small bright square of it, and a few brown grass stems broken at the edge. From down here the sky looked very far away. He thought about Thomas Dawson, his great-grandfather, the man who had bought this land in 1891 with $1,100 and a sorrel mare, who had built the farmhouse in a single winter, who had planted the hickory windbreak that still stood at the north end of this field. The man in the one photograph Earl knew of him, a black-and-white print from maybe 1910, a man with a beard and a direct expression standing in front of a barn, not smiling. Men didn't smile in photographs in 1910. But something in the eyes that Earl had always read as satisfaction, the look of a man who knew something good. Thomas Dawson had farmed this land for 40 years, had died on it in 1931, age 66, had left it to his son William, who left it to his son Roy, who left it to Earl's father James, who left it to Earl. For generations of men who had walked this field and plowed it and cursed the way the north end never drained right, and none of them had known. Or had they? Earl thought about his father steering around the soft spots near the hickory line, the way he'd done it without comment, without explanation, with the deliberateness of someone who has a reason, the way he'd kept the north field in hay, year after year, a choice that didn't quite make economic sense when the rest of the ground was more productive and hay prices were never certain. He'd always assumed it was habit, inertia, the way farmers sometimes kept doing what their fathers had done without rethinking why. But what if it wasn't? What if it was care? What if his father had known, or suspected, or been told something he'd never passed on? Earl turned the coin over in his fingers. 1893, 2 years after Thomas Dawson bought the land. The same year Thomas would have been 28 years old, newly married, newly settled, a man who had chosen this particular piece of Kentucky ground and had reasons for that choice that he'd apparently taken with him when he died. The coin was gold. He could feel the weight of it, the density that was different from any base metal. He'd held gold before, jewelry mostly, his wife's rings. This was something like that, but more concentrated, a small disc of the thing itself with no sentiment attached to it, just the metal and what the metal meant. He stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees and walked to the door at the far end of the room. The iron hardware had surface rust, but the metal itself was sound. He took hold of the handle, a simple bar latch, and lifted it. The door opened inward, smoothly, without the scraping protest he'd expected. The hinges had been kept, or the dryness of the sealed air had kept them. He pulled the door open and shone the light through. The next space was larger, significantly larger. The room beyond the door was not a room in the same sense as the first. It was more like a corridor, but wider and taller, maybe 12 feet wide and 12 feet high, and it extended away from the door in both directions. To the left it ran perhaps 40 feet before turning. To the right it was shorter, maybe 20 feet, ending in another door. Along the left wall of the corridor, the long stretch of it, there were more crates. Not 8. Earl counted quickly, moving the flashlight along the wall, taking in the rows stacked too high in places. He counted 30, 40, 50, more. The crates went down the corridor as far as the light reached, stacked against the wall in a line that stretched to the turn and possibly beyond. They were the same style as the ones in the first room, wooden slat construction, each one on a timber platform, each one sealed. But they weren't all the same size. Some were the dimensions he'd already seen, the jar-sized ones. Others were larger, 2 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, or bigger still. One in the middle of the row was a full 4 feet on a side, a cube of wood bound with iron strapping. Earl stood in the doorway between the first room and the corridor and looked at all of it, and the number he was trying to calculate kept eluding him because the premise of the calculation was too large. He knew what a coin weighed. He knew roughly how many coins fit in a jar. He could do that math. But the number of jars he was looking at, the number of crates, the uncertainty about what was in the larger ones, the math kept sliding away from him, too big to hold. He walked slowly along the corridor, running his flashlight over the crates. Some had writing on the outside, faded stenciling in black paint that was still legible on the ones that hadn't been exposed to moisture. Grain, one red, and hardware, and farm tools. He understood those labels now as cover, the kind of labels you put on something you don't want a visitor to identify correctly. Nobody looks twice at a crate labeled farm tools. He moved his light along the wall more carefully, and what he saw stopped him mid-step. Not all the crates were sealed in the same way. Most of them had lids that had been nailed shut, simple slat wood over slat wood, the nail heads visible and rusted but still holding. But 3 of the larger crates, the ones with iron strapping around them, had been closed differently. The lids on these were fitted into grooves cut into the crate sides, the kind of joinery that took skill and time, the kind you did when you wanted something to stay closed for a long time, without the wood shifting or the nails working loose. They weren't locked. They were just built to stay shut. He put his hand on the top of the nearest iron-strapped crate and felt the wood beneath his palm. Cold and hard, dry as old bone. He pressed down. Nothing gave. Whatever was inside was dense. Heavy. He thought about opening it. He had the pry bar. He could work the lid free in a few minutes. But something made him hesitate, and after a moment he understood what it was. The same instinct that had made him careful going down the rope, the same thing that made him test each step around the hole's edge before he put his weight down. There was a right order to things. You looked before you reached. You understood what you were dealing with before you started disturbing it. He left the iron-strapped crates closed and kept walking. At intervals along the corridor floor, between the crate platforms, he noticed small iron rings set into the stone, the kind you'd use for lashing down cargo or running a rope through to tie off a load. They were evenly spaced, about 8 feet apart, the whole length of the corridor. He counted 7 of them on the section he could see. They were old, the metal gone dark and rough with age, but they were set deep and solid. This space had been designed for moving things in and out, for working in, not just for storing. Someone had brought things down here in a way that required rigging, required multiple people, required a plan. The scale of that realization settled over him slowly. One man didn't build this. One man didn't carry what was in these crates down into a hand-dug underground space and arrange it into organized rows with labels and iron tie-down rings. This had been a project, a serious one. Months, maybe years, of work by people who knew what they were doing and who kept their mouths shut about it well enough that 130 years had passed without anyone knowing it was here, or without anyone saying they knew. He reached the far end of the corridor and turned the corner. The corridor continued another 30 feet and then opened into a second large room, this one with a higher ceiling, perhaps 14 feet, and a floor that was not packed earth but flat stone, carefully laid. The room was maybe 40 feet square. It was not empty. In the center of the room, arranged in a rough circle, were 7 wooden chests. Old ones, the kind you'd call sea chests, with curved lids and iron locks and iron handles at the corners. They were big, each one the size of a steamer trunk. The wood was dark with age and the iron fittings had gone a deep rust brown, but the chests themselves sat solid and whole on the stone floor. Whoever had built this room had built it to last, and the room had done its job. Along the walls of this room there were shelves, proper built-in shelves of heavy timber, and on the shelves were more jars, more containers, stacked and organized in a way that spoke of care and system. Not scattered, not thrown in by someone in a hurry. Arranged with the deliberateness of someone who expected them to stay there a long time and wanted to be able to account for them. On the wall above the shelves, above the north-facing row of them, there was something Earl hadn't expected to find down here. A map. It had been drawn in ink on a large piece of heavy paper or light canvas, mounted flat against the stone wall and covered over with a piece of glass that had been fitted into a wooden frame spiked into the mortar joints of the stone. The glass had kept the document. It had yellowed somewhat, and there were water-stain marks along one edge where something had gotten in despite everything. But the drawing itself was clear, a diagram of this space, these rooms, this corridor, the chamber he was standing in, all of it rendered in a careful hand with dimensions marked and compass directions indicated, and a key in the corner written in small tight script he couldn't read from where he stood. He walked closer and bent toward the glass to read the key. The handwriting was old. The kind of handwriting that had been taught with a pen nib and a blotter in the late 1800s, precise and slanted, each letter formed with attention. He read it slowly, moving his headlamp to make the light fall squarely on the words. The key was in two sections. The first section labeled the rooms and spaces: primary storage, secondary storage, main corridor, counting room. The room he was in was labeled counting room on the map. The second section of the key was a single line, written in a slightly different hand, as though added later by someone else or by the same person at a different time. The ink was darker than the rest of the map, fresher if such a word applied to something that had been down here for decades. It read, "All of this belongs to the land. The land belongs to those who keep it." Below that, in the same dark ink, a name: Thomas J. Dawson. Earl stood in the counting room of his own land, beneath the north field that had never drained right, and read his great-grandfather's name on the wall, and understood that the man in the photograph, the one with the direct expression and the look of a man who knew something good, had known something very good indeed. He hadn't inherited a farm that barely made ends meet. He'd inherited the secret beneath it, sealed away for over 100 years, waiting for a moment that looked, in the pale beam of a work flashlight on an October morning, very much like this one. He stood at the map for a long time, reading it as carefully as the dim light allowed. The scale drawn in the corner suggested the main corridor was roughly 80 feet long. The primary storage room where he'd entered was at the south end. The counting room where he stood now occupied the north end. The map showed a third branch off the main corridor, a shorter one running west, that he hadn't noticed yet. The notation beside it read simply, "Records." He hadn't seen a door for that branch. He'd been moving through the corridor by flashlight, focused on the crates, and he must have walked past it. He turned back toward the corridor to look for it, then stopped himself. His hands were cold. His knees ached. He'd been underground for almost an hour with no one knowing where he was, which was the kind of thing that was fine until it wasn't. The map would still be here tomorrow. The records room would still be here. The crates would still be here. Nothing about this space suggested urgency. If anything, the opposite. This was a place built around patience, around the idea that what mattered could be set aside and preserved and waited on. Thomas Dawson had understood something about time that most people in a hurry don't, that the right thing, kept safe, keeps its value. Earl could afford to be as patient as his great-grandfather had been. He stayed in the counting room for what he later estimated was half an hour, though he had no reliable sense of time down there in the still air. He walked the perimeter of the room, examining the shelves without touching anything. He looked at the 7 chests in the center without opening them. He went back to the corridor and walked its length again, counting the crates a second time, arriving at a number that he wrote in the dirt with his finger and then smudged out, as if writing it down made it more real than he was prepared to deal with. He thought about what he knew, which wasn't much, and what he suspected, which was more than his practical farmer's mind was comfortable holding. He thought about the coins in the jar. 1893, gold. His great-grandfather had been a farmer, or that was what the family understood, what the records said, what the local histories mentioned when they mentioned him at all. Thomas Dawson, farmer, Bledsoe County, established the Dawson farm in 1891. But a man who built a space like this, the engineering of it, the dry-laid stone, the fitted timber, the careful organization, wasn't only a farmer. This was the work of someone with resources and knowledge beyond what a young farmer 2 years off a neighbor's payroll should have had. Where had it come from? Earl crouched down and picked up another coin from the open jar he'd left on the floor of the first room. 1889. He found another one in the jar. 1887. He tipped a few more out and sorted through them. The dates range from the early 1880s through the mid-1890s. All gold. All American coinage. Liberty had eagles and double eagles, the coins of that era. They weren't rare as individual specimens, but each one was worth many times its face value in gold content alone, and there were hundreds of them in this jar. And there were dozens of jars in the 8 crates of the first room alone, and there were more than 50 crates in the corridor. He put the coins back, put the lid back on the jar, put the jar back in the crate. He sat down on the stone floor with his back against the cold wall and looked up at the ceiling above him, at the old timber beams still holding what they'd been holding for over 100 years. His great-grandfather had put those beams there, had fitted those stones, had written his name on the map in the counting room, had labeled the crates grain and hardware to hide what was inside from anyone who might come upon this place without an invitation. And then Thomas Dawson had sealed this space and farmed above it for 40 years and died and left the land to his son without, apparently, leaving the knowledge. Why? Earl thought about his father steering around the soft spots near the hickory line. He thought about the Northfield's reputation in the family for being difficult. He thought about the way the ground had always felt different here, always sat wrong. The way you can sometimes feel, without being able to say how, that something is being held underneath. He got to his feet. The cold was getting through his jacket now, the underground chill more assertive than he'd noticed at first, and his knees ached from the hard floor. He needed to think. He needed to think somewhere warmer, and with a cup of something hot, and without a tractor hanging at a 30-degree angle above his head. He found the rope and climbed back up to the surface. The October sky was enormous after the closed space below. He stood at the edge of the hole and filled his lungs with cold air and looked out at the field, the long brown sweep of it toward the hickory line. The trees stood dark and still. A crow crossed the sky from east to west, far away, not calling. The world looked exactly as it had looked that morning when he'd come out here to plow a winter cover crop on difficult ground. Nothing had changed up here. Everything had changed down there. He stood for a while at the field's edge, not moving, just looking. The tractor sat at its wrong angle, the black smear of the collapsed hole around its front corner. He'd need to call someone about getting the machine back upright. There were rigging companies in Hardin who did that kind of work, farm equipment recovery. But he wasn't going to call them today. He wasn't going to call anyone who would come out here and see the hole and start asking questions before he had answers to offer. He walked the perimeter of the hole one more time, keeping 3 feet of clearance from the edge. The surface had stayed stable while he'd been underground. No new cracking, no additional settling. The old planks that had given way were visible in the hole's cross-section, a 6-inch layer of blackwood that had been holding the weight of soil and grass for over a century, doing its job until today. The rest of the plank ceiling was still holding in the sections the tractor hadn't come down on. He could see it from the hole's edge if he crouched, the intact timber extending away from the point of failure. He thought about the weight of a tractor, the force of it coming down on that one spot. He thought about the planks holding everything else, the whole ceiling of the corridor and the primary storage room and the counting room, holding it for 130 years through wet springs and dry summers and frost heave and the slow settling of the earth above. He thought about the engineer, if that's what you'd call the person who had designed this, who had understood what the ground above would do over time and had built accordingly. That wasn't Thomas Dawson working alone. It couldn't have been. The knowledge in that construction went beyond what any self-taught farmer of that era would have had access to. Somewhere in the history of this land, before or just after Thomas Dawson bought it, there had been someone with real skill at work. He needed to know who. He picked up his phone and looked at it. No missed calls except Claire's, which he didn't feel ready to return yet. He wasn't sure what he would say to her. He wasn't sure what to say to anyone. The letter from the bank was still on the kitchen table, and 60 days was still 60 days, but the letter felt different now, the way a problem feels different when you've found, somewhere beneath it, a possible answer you weren't expecting. Possible. He held on to that word. He was a farmer. He didn't count anything until it was in the barn, and the barn door was shut. He picked the coin back up from where he'd set it by the rope anchor and turned it over a few times in his hand. He knew a little about gold coin values. Not much, but enough to know that a pre-1900 American gold eagle was worth well above its metal content on the collector's market, that the condition of a coin mattered as much as its age and rarity, that a jar of them in the condition he'd seen would represent a serious sum. He didn't know exactly how serious. That was what Garrett Cole was for. He thought about what else he didn't know. He didn't know what was in the 7 sea chests in the counting room, each one large enough to hold something considerably more than coins. He didn't know what was in the iron-strapped crates with the fitted lids in the corridor. He didn't know what was in the records room that the map had, shown branching west off the main corridor. He didn't know whether those records, if they existed and were legible, would tell him anything about Thomas Dawson's origins, about where the money had come from, about why a man who bought 200 acres for $1,100 had apparently had access to resources that made that purchase look like pocket change. He didn't know yet what this would mean for the farm, for Claire, for the bank and their letter and their 60 days. He didn't know whether this was something that would take a week to resolve or a year, or whether it would resolve cleanly at all, or whether there were complications waiting in those records that he couldn't anticipate. He only knew what he'd seen. Rooms beneath his land. His great-grandfather's name on a wall. A jar full of gold coins. A map drawn by a man who had wanted someone, someday, to find it. He thought about who to call. He thought about the question behind the question, which was this. Thomas Dawson had built a room beneath the north field, had filled it with what appeared to be a significant quantity of gold coin, had covered the entrance with timber and earth, had written his name on the wall in the room he called the counting room, and had said that all of it belonged to the land. And the land had come down through the family, generation to generation, for 130 years. What did that make it? Earl Dawson stood in the cold October morning on his own ground, 50 feet from a hole in the earth that led down to something he couldn't yet measure or name. And he did what farmers do when the thing in front of them is bigger than what they're prepared for. He stood still for a long moment, and then he started figuring out the next practical step. He needed someone he could trust. Someone who knew about things like this, about old coins and what they were worth, about what you were supposed to do when you found something on your own land that the world had no record of. He needed someone who wouldn't make this into a circus before he understood what he had. He thought of a man named Garrett Cole, who had an antique shop in Hardin and had been buying and selling old farm estate items for 30 years. Earl had sold him some things from his mother's house after she passed. Garrett was cautious and quiet and did not seem to derive any pleasure from other people's business. That was the kind of person this moment called for. He looked at the coin still in his jacket pocket, the one he hadn't put back. He looked at the hole in the ground. He looked at the hickory line. He walked back down the lane to the farmhouse. The kitchen was warm. The letter from the bank was on the table. He put the coin on top of the letter and looked at the two of them together for a moment. One thing that had come for him and one thing that had been waiting beneath his feet for over 100 years. He made a fresh cup of coffee. He sat down. He thought about Thomas Dawson, age 28, buying this ground in 1891 with $1,100 and a sorrel mare, and the particular look in his eyes in that one photograph. The look of a man who knew something good. Earl picked up his phone and dialed Garrett Cole's number. He didn't know yet what he had found. He didn't know the scale of it, didn't know the history behind it, didn't know what the answer to all of it would mean for the farm, for Claire, for the bank's letter on the table, for the next 60 days or the next 60 years. He didn't know yet that what was beneath the north field would bring people to his door that he hadn't anticipated, or that the secret Thomas Dawson had buried there would turn out to be more complicated than a room full of gold coins, or that the map on the wall in the counting room had more to tell him than he'd been close enough to read. He only knew that the ground had opened up beneath him on a Tuesday morning in October, and that what was down there had been put there by someone who shared his name. The phone rang twice. Garrett answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the flat, unhurried tone of a man who opened his shop at 9 and closed it at 5, and was in no particular hurry about either. "Earl," he said, "what can I do for you?" Earl looked at the gold coin on top of the bank letter. He said, "I need you to come out to the farm. I need you to look at something." "How soon?" Earl thought about the tractor tilted at its wrong angle in the north field, the hole in the ground beside it, the door at the far end of the first room, the corridor beyond with its rows of crates, the counting room with its 7 sea chests, and its map on the wall, and his great-grandfather's name written in dark ink. Garrett Cole arrived at 11:23 in the morning, which Earl knew because he'd been watching the clock on the kitchen wall since 9 o'clock in a way he wasn't proud of. He'd spent those 2.5 hours doing things with his hands to keep his mind from running ahead of itself. He'd swept the porch, checked the water level in the stock tank, tightened a fence staple that had been loose for a month. None of it needed doing urgently. He'd been moving through the motions of the farm the way you do when the thing you're waiting for is too large to think about directly. He put on a fresh pot of coffee when he heard Garrett's truck coming down the county road, the particular diesel sound of it that Earl had heard 100 times when Garrett came out to look at estate lots before a farm sale. He was in his 60s. Garrett, a tall, lean man with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead, and the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had learned through experience never to show excitement before he had facts. He bought and sold antiques. Yes, but more precisely he dealt in American historical artifacts, farm tools, coins, military items, furniture from before 1920. He knew what old things were worth. More usefully, he knew how to keep his mouth shut about what he'd seen and where he'd seen it. Earl opened the back door before Garrett could knock. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Garrett came in, looked at Earl's face, and sat down at the kitchen table without being invited. He'd been in this kitchen before, after Margaret's funeral, after James Dawson's funeral before that, at the 2 points in Earl's life where the world had narrowed to a single room, and the kindness of being present was the only thing useful anyone could offer. He understood kitchens, Garrett did. He understood what it meant when a man sat you down at a table without preamble. Earl set a coffee cup in front of him and sat across from the bank letter, which was still there. Then he put the gold coin on the table between them. Garrett looked at it without touching it for a moment. Then he picked it up and held it to the light from the window. He turned it over. He looked at the date. He looked at Earl. Where did this come from? He asked. Earl told him. All of it, start to finish, the way the tractor had gone through, the rope descent, the rooms below, the crates, the corridor, the counting room, the map, his great-grandfather's name written on the wall in dark ink. He told it plainly, without decoration, the way you'd describe something that happened to you this morning, which it had. Garrett listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without expression, his coffee cup lifted and held halfway to his mouth, and then slowly set back down as the telling went on. When Earl finished, Garrett turned the coin over one more time in his fingers. Liberty Head Double Eagle, he said. $20 gold piece. This one's $18.93. He set it gently on the table. Good condition. Not circulated much. You said there were jars of them? 8 crates worth. In the first room. And more crates in the corridor. 50 or more. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I need to see it. They drove up the lane in Earl's truck, which was loud in the way trucks are when the exhaust has a small hole in it that you keep meaning to fix. Garrett said nothing during the drive. He looked out the passenger window at the fields passing on either side, the brown October grass, the turned earth of the passes Earl had made before the ground had stopped him. He looked at the tractor when it came into view, sitting at its wrong angle above the hole, and Earl saw him calculating something behind his eyes. They parked and walked to the hole. Garrett crouched at the edge and looked down without speaking. He had the compact, methodical quality of a man reading a document. His eyes moved over the collapsed timber at the rim, the stone walls visible below, the floor in the flashlight beam Earl had clicked on. He stood up. How old is the construction? Earl asked. Garrett shook his head slightly, meaning he didn't know yet. Who built this? That's what I'm trying to find out. They tied off the rope to the same limestone anchor Earl had used that morning and went down one at a time. Garrett second, both flashlights on now. In the primary storage room, Garrett moved straight to the open crate, to the jar of coins Earl had left out on the floor. He crouched and looked at it, then lifted the jar and held it so the light came through the glass. He turned it slowly, his face close to it. He said nothing for a long time. Then he set the jar down carefully and opened the lid the way a person opens something old and fragile, not with haste, just with care. He took one coin out, held it between his thumb and forefinger in the beam of the flashlight. He turned it. He took out a second coin, a third. He laid them in a row on the flat of his palm and looked at all three. Earl, he said, not loudly, not urgently, just with the particular evenness of someone controlling their voice on purpose. Yeah, these aren't circulation coins. Garrett's voice was steady. A circulated coin from this era shows wear on the high points, the eagle's feathers, the lady's hair. These don't have that wear. These were stored, set aside. Somebody was collecting them or keeping them out of circulation from the moment they were struck. What's that mean for the value? Garrett looked up at him. A worn example of this piece in this date goes for maybe $1,500, $2,000 at auction, depending on the day and the buyer. An uncirculated example, if that's what we're looking at, goes for considerably more. He paused. And you said there are jars and jars of them. 8 crates in this room. A lot more in the corridor. Garrett put the coins back in the jar with the careful reverence of a man returning something to a church he's not sure he has the right to be in. He stood up and looked at Earl, and for the first time since he'd arrived his expression shifted slightly, something moving behind the careful blankness of his professional manner. Show me the corridor, he said. They went through the first room and opened the door to the main corridor. Garrett walked it the way Earl had walked it that morning, slowly, moving the flashlight along the rows of crates stacked against the wall. He stopped at the stenciled labels. He put his hand on the wood of a crate marked farm tools and felt its surface. He moved to the next one and the next, reading each label, touching each crate with the same attention. He stopped at the iron-strapped crates. "These are different," he said. "The joinery," Earl told him. "Fitted lids, not nailed. And they're heavier. I could tell from the way they sit on the platform." Garrett looked at the iron strapping, at the dark metal bands running around the outside of the nearest crate. He looked at the fitted lid and the groove it sat in. He put both hands on top of the crate and pressed, and Earl watched him register the density of whatever was inside. Then he pressed again, more slowly, a man measuring rather than testing. "Earl," he said, "this is not the weight of coin." He stepped back and looked at the full row of iron-strapped crates, 6 of them, and ran his light along the length of them. He looked at the iron tie-down rings in the floor, then at the ceiling, then at the crates again. He was working something out. "Do you know what moving companies used to move gold bullion in this era?" he asked. Earl didn't. Rigging teams. Purpose-built wooden crates, iron-bound for structural integrity because a wooden crate under lateral stress will shear its nails and drop whatever's inside. He ran his finger along the iron strapping. "This isn't decorative. This is load engineering. Whoever packed these knew what they were doing and knew how much they weighed." He paused. "And they weighed enough to need help." He stepped back and turned to Earl. "Do you have a longer pry bar?" Earl had brought one down the rope in his pack. He handed it over. Garrett took his time working the fitted lid, getting the bar into the groove on one side, applying slow, steady pressure rather than forcing it. The wood was old, but it wasn't weak. It took 4 minutes of careful work before the lid began to move upward, cracking the seal with a sound like a slow breath being released. The sound seemed loud in the stone corridor, and then it was gone, swallowed by the stillness of the underground air. Garrett lifted the lid and set it to the side. Both flashlights went into the crate at once. The interior was lined with heavy canvas that had gone dark with age. Garrett peeled back one corner of it with 2 fingers. Below the canvas, catching both beams and returning them as a pale warm gleam, were bars. Metal bars, roughly the size of a brick, arranged in 2 layers separated by another piece of canvas. Garrett lifted one out with both hands and stood straight, holding it at chest height. It was 8 inches long and 3 inches wide and maybe 2 inches deep. On one face it was stamped, U.S. Assay Office, Louisville. Below that, a number and a date, 1891. Below that, a weight marking in troy ounces. Garrett held it for a moment, reading those markings twice over, and then he looked at Earl with an expression that had finally, completely abandoned the professional blankness he'd been maintaining. "It's a gold assay bar," he said. Earl had gathered that from the United States Assay Office in Louisville, which ceased operations in 1911. He turned the bar so Earl could see the stamp clearly. "This is federal gold." Or it was. The Louisville operation processed gold from regional mines and coin sources, refined it, and forwarded it as assay bars to the main mints. He paused. "I've seen one of these at auction. Once. It's sold for considerably more than its gold content, because of the provenance, the federal markings, the era, the historical significance. A collector doesn't just buy the gold. He buys the story attached to the gold, and this story is 130 years old." He looked at the crate, then at the row of iron-strapped crates behind it. "How many of these crates are like this?" Earl counted. 6 of the iron-strapped ones. Could be more. Garrett set the bar gently back into the canvas and took a breath and let it out slowly. He looked down the corridor again, then turned his head and looked toward the door at the far end, the one that led to the counting room. He stood that way for a moment with the quiet of a man who has just understood something large and is giving it the space that large things require. "Earl," he said. "Yeah. How much do you know about the current gold market?" "Enough to know it's higher than it used to be. Considerably higher. An assay bar of this weight at current spot price." He did the arithmetic in his head with the focused expression of a man who'd been doing this kind of math for 30 years. He stopped. "Multiplied by however many bars are in this crate. And however many crates." He looked at the 6 iron-strapped crates in their row. "And that's before the numismatic value of the coin. Before whatever's in the counting room." He stopped again. He said, carefully, as if testing the words before he let them out, "We need to stop guessing and start counting." They counted what they could without opening every crate. Garrett worked through the corridor with a pad from his jacket pocket, noting the dimensions and type of each crate, assessing from the stenciling and construction what might be inside. The 6 iron-strapped crates were almost certainly bullion. Their weight, their reinforced construction, the tie-down rings in the floor below them all pointed the same direction. The stencil-labeled crates, grain and farm tools and hardware, were almost certainly more coin. The same construction as the open ones in the primary storage room, the same weight distribution. The unmarked crates in the back row, the ones without any stenciling at all, he didn't speculate about out loud. Earl watched Garrett work and thought about what he'd said. We need to stop guessing and start counting. That was the farmer in it, the part he understood completely. You didn't celebrate a harvest before you'd weighed the grain. You didn't count on an income before you had it in hand. Whatever was down here was down here, and it had been down here for 130 years, and it would still be here tomorrow and the day after that. The counting could be done right and properly, or it could be done in a hurry, and in his experience doing things in a hurry had never once improved the result. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. They walked the length of the corridor together, past every crate, past the iron tie-down rings set into the floor at intervals, past the points where the ceiling timbers showed the marks of age but not failure, all the way to the door that Earl had found that morning. He unlatched it and pushed it open, and they both stepped through. Garrett stopped. Earl watched him standing in the entrance to the counting room with his flashlight sweeping from the stone-shelved walls to the 7 sea chests arranged in their rough circle at the center of the stone floor. And he saw in the older man's face the expression of someone confronting a thing they have no immediate framework for. Garrett Cole had spent 30 years buying and selling the contents of barns and farmhouses and estate sales. He'd found good things in unexpected places. He'd developed, through all of that, a reasonable expectation of the scale of what surprise could offer. This exceeded that expectation by a margin he wasn't prepared for. He walked slowly to the nearest sea chest and stood over it. These were proper chests, not the decorative reproductions you found at antique markets, but working chests made to hold heavy things and travel hard. The wood was old dark oak, dried to a density that made it heavier than it looked. The iron hardware had gone the color of old blood with oxidation, but the structure itself was sound. The domed lids fit their frames with the precision of craft. He crouched at the first chest and looked at the lock. Massive iron hasp, padlock the size of a man's fist, keyhole on the face. He stood and moved to the second chest. The same. Third, fourth, fifth. All the same hardware, all the same design. He looked at the sixth chest. Its padlock was different. Smaller, newer looking than the others. And on close examination, the hasp it hung from was newer too, a replacement, the old one having been removed at some point, and this one put in its place. It was still old, but not as old as the chest itself. He looked at Earl. Someone opened this one, he said, at some point after the others were locked. Within the last 40 years, maybe 50. He straightened up. The padlock style is consistent with what was available from maybe 1940 onward. Before that, during that, Earl thought about that. His grandfather William had farmed this land from 1931 until 1968, when Earl's father James took over. His grandfather, who had kept the north field in hay without ever explaining why. Maybe William found this room, Earl said. Maybe he found just this one chest, Garrett said, and put it back, and left the rest. Earl felt that thought settle into him. His grandfather had been a quiet man in the way of men who keep things to themselves, not shy but contained. His feelings pressed flat by the Depression years and the war and all the season-to-season work of keeping a farm alive when the margins were thin and the weather didn't cooperate. Earl had known him as an old man, as the grandfather who taught him to splice wire and read weather and keep a tractor engine without taking it to a shop. He'd never known him as a young man who might have climbed down a rope into his father's hidden rooms and looked at what was there and made a decision about it. What kind of decision would you make at 30 years old, finding something like this beneath your own field? He thought he might understand. The locked chests, without keys, presented a choice. Garrett was right that they could be forced. The padlocks were old and their metal had degraded. A bolt cutter would go through them without much effort. But he wanted to try something first. He went back out to the corridor and looked at the shelves in the primary storage room, then along the corridor walls, examining the spaces between crates. He was looking for the kind of thing you kept close to the thing it opened. Small, metal, easy to miss in the shadows. He found them on the third shelf of the storage room, in a small wooden box that he almost missed because it was the same color as the shelf it sat on. The box was unlocked, and inside it, laid in a row on a piece of old flannel, were 7 keys. Iron keys, old, each one tagged with a small paper label on a piece of string. The labels were numbered, 1 through 7. He brought the box to Garrett in the counting room. Garrett looked at the keys for a moment. Then he looked at the chests. 7 keys. 7 chests. He took the key labeled 1 and tried it in the padlock of the nearest chest. The lock was stiff, but the key turned, and the hasp clicked open. The lid of the first chest was heavy, and they lifted it together, pushing it up and back until it rested against the wooden lip at the rear of the frame. The interior was lined with the same heavy canvas as the bullion crates in the corridor, and what sat on top of the canvas, arranged in careful rows, were coin trays. The kind used for storing valuable coin. Wooden frames with individual circular depressions, each depression holding 1 coin. Each tray held 20 coins. There were 4 trays on top of the first layer of canvas. Garrett lifted the top tray carefully and held it in both hands while Earl shone the light across it. The coins in the depressions were larger than the double eagles from the jars. They were gold, the same dull warm gleam. But these were different. Thicker, heavier looking, their surfaces showing none of the handling that came from years in circulation. Each one bore a seated female figure on one face and an eagle on the reverse. Garrett said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "These are seated. Liberty gold pieces. $20 pieces. Proof quality." He lifted one from its depression with great care and held it to the light. The surface of it caught the beam cleanly, with a sharpness that distinguished it from the circulated coins in the corridor jars. He turned it. He turned it back. He set it very gently back in its place. There were 4 trays in the top layer. He lifted the canvas beneath them. Another 4 trays. He lifted that canvas. A third layer for more trays. 12 trays. 240 coins in the first chest alone. Proof quality specimens. He looked at Earl with the expression of a man who has stopped pretending he has a framework for this. "How much?" Earl asked. "At current market, a proof quality seated Liberty double eagle in this condition." Garrett stopped. He started again. "A fair individual specimen of this coin, not proof quality, just a normal circulated example. At today's market, sells for $1,500 to $3,000 depending on date and rarity. A proof example, if authenticated, can sell for 10 times that or more, depending on the specific date. Some dates are significantly rarer than others. Some years, only a handful of proof examples were minted." He looked at the 240 coins arranged in their trays. "I would need to go through each one by date and condition. This is not something I can tell you a number on right now." Earl understood. He closed the chest, and they moved to the second one. Inside, more trays, the same style, but these held smaller coins. Gold half eagles, $5 pieces, proof quality, 8 trays of 20 each. 160 coins. The third chest held yet another denomination. Fourth chest, coin trays again, mixed denominations, all proof quality by the look of them, all clearly separated from circulation and kept. The fifth chest held documents. A thick stack of papers, each one in a protective sleeve of some kind of treated cloth that had kept them intact. "Certificates," Garrett said, picking through the top few carefully. "Certificates of weight and assay." These were the official documents that accompanied a gold shipment from a field office to the main mint, the paper trail of a transfer that had been recorded and verified. He set them down. "These aren't just gold records. These are provenance records. Whoever kept these was documenting the origins of every piece in these rooms." The sixth chest, the one with the replacement lock, was different from all the others. Inside it, below a layer of canvas, was not coin or documents. It held a collection of objects wrapped individually in cloth, small items, personal in scale. Garrett unwrapped one, a pocket watch, gold case, with an inscription on the back. Another, a ring, a woman's ring, set with small stones. Another, a folded piece of paper that, when opened with great care, proved to be a letter in Thomas Dawson's hand, much shorter than the one they'd find later in the records room. It was addressed to no one in particular and said only, "For safekeeping. These belong to her. They should stay with the land until someone knows what to do with them." Her, Earl said. Garrett folded the paper back gently. A woman in his life. Whether that's his wife or someone else I can't tell you. The seventh chest held more trays, more coin. They didn't count it that afternoon. They'd seen enough to understand the scale and the afternoon light. What little reached underground by inference was telling them to stop. We're going to need help, Garrett said. Real help. Not from me. He pulled out his phone, saw there was no signal, and pocketed it. I know a woman at the University of Louisville. She does historical artifact assessment for estate legal proceedings. She knows coin, she knows gold, she knows how to handle something like this without making noise. He looked at Earl squarely. But before you talk to her or anyone else, you need a lawyer. A good one. What you found here is on your property, and in most situations that's sufficient for ownership. But given that some of this material appears to be federal assay product from a United States government operation, there are questions you want answered before you start moving anything. Earl had thought about that. Some of it. It's not necessarily a problem, Garrett said. The Louisville assay office closed in 1911. Its records are in the National Archives. Whether anything here was ever reported missing is something that can be researched. 130 years changes the legal landscape in ways that favor the person who's been sitting on the land. But you want to know where you stand before word gets out. How long can we keep this between us? Garrett thought about the tractor visible from the county road, tilted at its angle in the north field. You'll need a story for that machine, he said. Equipment failure, broken axle, something that takes a few days to sort out. The hole itself is not visible from the road if you don't stand at the right angle, but the tractor is. He paused. I know a lawyer in Lexington. Agricultural and historical property law. He's handled things like this before. Not exactly like this, but things where old land and old records and old money intersect. He's discreet. Earl thought about 60 days. About the bank letter. He thought about the number Garrett had named for the floor estimate on the coin alone, before the bullion, before the chests, and he thought about how that number compared to what he owed the bank, which was not a comparison that required much arithmetic. All right, he said. Before they left the counting room that afternoon, Earl walked back to the map on the wall and stood close enough to read everything in the corner key. He read the room labels again: primary storage, main corridor, counting room, and the branch corridor running west that he'd found on the map but not yet visited. Records. He found Garrett at his shoulder. There's another room, Earl said. I know. I saw it on the map. Where's the door? They went back into the main corridor and walked it slowly this time, looking at the wall closely rather than at the crate rows. Halfway down, on the west side, the wall changed slightly. The stone was the same, but there was a vertical seam running floor to ceiling that was cleaner than the joints around it, the kind of seam a door leaves in a wall when the door is fitted very precisely to its frame and sealed on all sides. Earl put his hand against it and felt along the edge. He found the latch set flush into the stone itself, a small iron lever recessed into a cavity in the mortar joint. He pressed it downward and heard a click, and the door, which was not a door in the way the others had been doors but rather a section of the wall itself, swung inward 6 inches. The air from inside was the same cold mineral stillness as the rest of the underground space. Earl pulled the door open fully. It was thick, heavier than the others, and it moved silently on hinges that had been fitted with the same care as everything else down here. Inside was a room roughly 12 by 15 feet. Unlike the primary storage room and the counting room, it held no chests and no crates. The walls on 3 sides were fitted with shelves of the same heavy timber construction as the corridor, and on the shelves, row upon row, were ledgers. They were old, bound in dark leather, spines faced out. Each spine had a label attached, small paper labels written in the same hand Earl had seen on the map, dates, or what appeared to be dates. He moved his flashlight across the row at eye level and read them. 1882, 1883, 1884, A, 1884, B, 1885. They ran without gap through to 1929. 47 years of records. Beside the ledgers, on the lower shelves, were document boxes. The old kind, pasteboard with cloth covering, the kind you found in old law offices and county courthouses, each one labeled in the same hand. He read a few labels. Correspondence, 1886 to 1891. Certificates of weight and assay, 1882 to 1895. Property records, Bledsoe County. And on the bottom shelf, set apart from the others and wrapped in oilcloth that had been tied with a cord. Personal. Earl stood in the doorway to the records room for a long moment without going in. Garrett was behind him, looking over his shoulder at the rows of ledgers, and Earl could hear him breathing. He finally walked in, moving to the nearest shelf, and picked up the first ledger carefully. Its cover was cold. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as on the map. The same elegant slanted script of a man who had been taught penmanship in the years before typewriters were common. The first entry was dated March 7, 1882, and below the date a single line of notation in a format that took Earl a moment to parse. A number, a description, a weight in troy ounces, a source designation, a disposition code. Gold coin, Liberty Head Eagle, $10, uncirculated, 140 pieces, 225. For troy ounce. Source, L4. Disposition, held in trust, primary. He turned the page. More entries, the same format, a different date, March 14, 1882. More coin, more weight, more source designations, more disposition codes. The next page. The next. Garrett read over his shoulder for a moment and then said, quietly, L4. That's a source designation. Louisville, I guess, given the assay bar stamps. The disposition code says trust. That's not a government term for forwarding to a mint. That means he held it himself. He kept it here. Earl set the ledger down and picked up the oilcloth parcel from the bottom shelf. He worked the cord off with careful fingers and unwrapped the cloth. Inside were 3 items: a second, thinner ledger with a red cover, a sheaf of papers folded together and tied with a different cord, and a sealed envelope with a name written on the front in ink that looked darker and fresher than everything else in this room. The envelope said, Thomas J. Dawson, for William. William was his grandfather, Thomas's son, the man who had farmed this land after Thomas died in 1931 and who had kept the north field in hay, year after year, without explaining why. Earl's hands were not entirely steady as he untied the cord around the papers. He unfolded them on the shelf surface and held the flashlight close. The top page was a letter, written in Thomas Dawson's hand, but with a slight change in the pen pressure, the writing of an older man. The date at the top was October 22, 1929, 2 years before he died. He read it slowly. William, if you are reading this, then I have died before I found the right moment to explain myself in person, which I fear may be the case. I am not well. The doctors say the heart is wearing down and the winter ahead will be hard. I have been meaning to write this letter for 10 years, and I have put it off out of cowardice, which is the honest word for it. So I will try to write it plainly now. I worked for the Louisville office of the Bureau of the Mint from 1882 to 1896. My position was that of field agent and weight certifier, which meant that I received gold coin and bullion from regional sources, weighed and certified their content, and arranged their transfer to the main office. For 14 years I did this work honestly and by the record, as the ledgers in this room will show. In 1893, as you may remember from your school books, the banks began to fail. 65 in a single month. The panic was worse in the cities than it was out here, but I saw what was coming before most people did, because I saw where the gold was and where it was going, and I understood that the institutions holding it were not as sound as they appeared. I watched the banks receive deposits and make loans against gold they did not actually have, and I believed, with a certainty that I could not ignore, that the collapse would be total. In that year I made a decision that I have never been certain was right. There were consignments of gold coin in my custody that had been misidentified in the Bureau records due to the chaos of the panic year. Clerical errors were common. Shipments were lost in transit. The records of what had gone where were badly kept during those months, and several consignments that passed through my hands were noted in the Bureau's books as lost in transit or unaccounted. I knew they were not lost. I had them. I had brought them here to this land, which I had just purchased, because I did not trust the banks to hold them, and I did not trust that the Bureau itself would survive. I told myself I would return them when the panic passed and the institutions were sound again. I told myself this for 10 years. The panic passed. The institutions recovered. I did not return them. By the time I understood clearly that I was not going to return them, I was too frightened to come forward with them. Too much time had passed. The explanation would have ruined me and put me in a federal prison and left your mother and you with nothing. So I sealed this room, and I farmed above it, and I hoped that when I was gone, whoever found it would have the clarity and the courage that I lacked. I do not say this to make myself smaller than I am. I believe the gold is safer here than it would have been in any bank in 1893. I believe the people who lost their savings in those collapses lost far more than what is in these rooms. I believe many things that may or may not excuse what I did. You will make your own judgment. What I know for certain is this. I did not spend a dollar of it. I did not use it for myself or your mother or you. I left it here for the land, or for whoever kept the land, because I came to believe, over 40 years of farming above it, that the only honest thing was to leave it to the ground that had kept it safe and trust that whoever came to it next would do what I could not. Do what I could not, William. Whatever that means to you. Your father, Thomas Jameson Dawson. Earl stood in the records room of his own farm, in a space his great-grandfather had built with his own hands and sealed and kept secret for 40 years, and he read that letter twice. Then he read it a third time more slowly. The way you read something you want to be sure you've understood correctly, because the understanding has weight to it that you don't want to carry wrongly. He read the line about 1893 again, about the banks failing and Thomas watching it happen and understanding what was coming before most people did. He read the line about the consignments in his custody that had been misidentified in the Bureau's records. He read, I told myself I would return them when the panic passed. He read, I did not return them. He read, by the time I understood clearly that I was not going to return them, I was too frightened to come forward. He thought about fear, about what it did to people. He had seen what debt fear did, had lived in it for 3 years, had let it sit on the kitchen table in a letter he couldn't bring himself to open for 5 days. He understood the particular quality of fear that lived in a situation you couldn't see a clean way out of, where every option looked worse than the option before, and you kept delaying because delaying at least preserved the possibility that something would change. Thomas had delayed for 40 years. The something that changed was him dying. Garrett read it over his shoulder without comment. When Earl looked back at him, Garrett's expression was the careful, measured blankness of a man thinking through something complicated. That changes things, Garrett said. Earl nodded. It doesn't change ownership. Garrett's voice was precise. What he held was on his land. He held it for 40 years, and the statute of limitations on federal property recovery for something like this is a real question. His lawyer would know better than Garrett, but the situation was not straightforward. He paused. But it changes what you need to do next. You can't just file a finder's report and have done with it. You need someone who specializes in this. Who? Garrett thought for a moment. There's a firm in Washington that handles historical federal claims. They've done work for families who found things on their property that turned out to have government provenance. They're expensive, but they know how to negotiate, and more often than not in cases like this, land in a family for generations, material held for a century, genuine uncertainty in the records, there are settlements that recognize the family's position. He met Earl's eyes. You don't have to give it all back. That's the short version. Earl folded the letter carefully and put it back in the oilcloth. He looked at the rows of ledgers, at the document boxes, at 47 years of careful records kept by a man who had been too frightened to come forward and too honest to pretend it wasn't there. He thought about Thomas Dawson farming above this room for 40 years, going up to the north field on his tractor, or his horse, or on foot, planting hay and tending it, and steering around the soft spots near the hickory line where the ceiling timbers were closest to the surface. A man carrying something enormous, alone, for his entire working life. Earl understood that. Not the specific weight of it, not the particular nature of what Thomas had done or hadn't done, but the carrying part. The part where you hold something too large for one person and you keep holding it because you can't figure out the right way to set it down. He picked up the red-covered ledger, which was thinner than the annual records ledgers and had no date on the spine. He opened it. This one was different. Not figures and source codes. Prose. Thomas Dawson's handwriting again, but here the writing was less formal, more like a man talking to himself on paper than like a man keeping official records. The first entry was dated 1896. Today I planted 20 acres of timothy in the north field for the first time. The ground is good there, better than it looks. I believe it will be good ground for a long time if it's left to what it does best. Some things want to be left alone to do their work. I am learning that. He read another entry from 1903. My son Edward walked the north field with me today. He is 9 years old. He wanted to know why the ground is softer up there near the hickory line. I told him it's the way the soil sits, that some ground holds water differently than other ground. He said it felt like something was underneath. I said maybe it does. He seemed satisfied with that. Earl stopped reading, set the ledger down carefully, beside the oilcloth and the letter and the keys. His great-grandfather had walked that field with Edward, with the son he intended to tell everything to. Edward had felt something underfoot, and Thomas had given him just enough of the truth to satisfy a 9-year-old's curiosity. It feels like something is underneath. Maybe it does. And then Edward had gone to France at 22 and not come home, and the truth had stayed sealed, and Thomas had written the letter to William and hidden it where William never found it. And the whole weight of it had passed on and on and on until a tractor broke through a rotted plank on an October morning in the 21st century, and a 58-year-old farmer went down a rope to see what was there. Earl closed the ledger and looked at Garrett. "Let's go up," he said. They climbed the rope back to the surface in the mid-afternoon, the sky now a flat pale gray that had moved in from the west since morning. The wind had picked up, and the hickory trees at the north end of the field were moving steadily. Earl stood at the edge of the hole and looked out at the field, and then at the tractor still tilted at its angle, and the sight of it struck him differently now than it had this morning. This morning it had been a problem, an accident, an expense, a nuisance on a day when he couldn't afford nuisances. Now it was an opening. It had broken through the floor of a space that had been waiting for 130 years. A man running a tractor across his own field on a cold October morning, doing ordinary work on difficult ground, and the ground had finally decided to be done with the secret. They walked back to the truck without speaking. Earl stood at the edge of the hole one last time before he left the field, looking down into the darkness below and then out at the hickory line. He'd worked this field his entire life, plowed it, hated it, driven across it in every season, in heat and mud and frozen ground. He'd stepped over these same patches of soft earth without knowing what they were above. He tried to calculate how many times he'd been within 10 feet of the spot where the tractor had gone through and felt nothing unusual beneath his boots except the faint wrongness the soil had always carried in this corner of the farm. 100 times. 1,000. He didn't know. He walked to the truck. As Earl started the engine and began to turn down the lane, he glanced once in his mirrors at the hole in the field and the tilted tractor and the hickory line behind it. The gray afternoon light had flattened everything, field and trees and sky all gone to the same quiet tone. Then he looked forward and saw the truck. It was parked on the county road at the far end of his lane, maybe 400 yards away. A dark pickup, not one he recognized, sitting still with the engine idling. From this distance, he could see the faint exhaust rising from the tailpipe. It had been there long enough to idle, long enough for whoever was in it to have a reason to wait. Earl slowed his truck without stopping. "That truck been there when you drove in?" he asked Garrett. Garrett looked. "No, I'd have noticed it." He was quiet a moment. "Could be nothing." "Could be," Earl said. "People stop on county roads." He kept driving. He watched the dark pickup while he drove down the lane toward it, and the truck didn't move until Earl was about 200 yards from the intersection. Then it pulled away from the shoulder and went east, unhurried, no particular speed, just moving on the way anyone moves on. He couldn't see the plate from this angle. He pulled out onto the county road and watched the taillights disappear around the far curve. He drove toward the farmhouse without saying anything else about it. He thought about Thomas Dawson's letter. "Do what I could not, William, whatever that means to you." He thought about the bank letter on the kitchen table, about 60 days, about his daughter, who had called that morning and heard something in his voice that had apparently been enough to put her in a car with her husband and her children and drive 4 hours north without being asked. He thought about what Garrett had said. "We need to stop guessing and start counting." The farmhouse came into view at the end of the lane. He pulled into the gravel and killed the engine. As he sat there, looking at the back of the house he'd lived in for 50 years, at the kitchen light still flickering through the window the way it had been flickering for 3 weeks, he heard tires on the gravel behind him. He turned. Claire's car came up the drive and stopped beside his truck. She got out, and she was not alone. Her husband Daniel was in the passenger seat, and in the back were their 2 kids, and Claire was looking at her father with an expression he hadn't seen on her face since Margaret's last week in the hospital. The expression of someone who has made a decision and driven a long way to act on it, and is not entirely sure they had the right. "Dad," she said. He got out of his truck. He stood in the gravel and looked at his daughter, at Daniel in the passenger seat, at his grandchildren looking out the back window with the alertness of kids who had been in a car for 4 hours and weren't sure what they'd arrived at. He thought about all the things he needed to tell her. About Garrett, who was standing a careful few feet away. About the hole in the north field. About the rooms below. About the ledgers and the chests and the iron-strapped crates and Thomas Dawson's name on a wall in the dark, and a letter written in 1929 by a man who was dying and afraid and trying to set something right from a distance of 40 years. He thought about the dark truck parked at the end of his lane. He thought about how much of it he was ready to say out loud. He opened his mouth to start. Inside the house, the telephone rang. He looked at Claire. She looked at the house. He held up one finger in the way that means a moment, and he went inside and picked up the kitchen handset on the fourth ring. The coin was still on the bank letter on the table. The voice on the other end was a man's, with a local accent, unhurried. He didn't give his name. He said, "Mr. Dawson, I understand you had some trouble with your tractor this morning up in the north field." Earl said nothing. The man continued, "I have a professional interest in that area of your property. I'd like to speak with you before you talk to lawyers or experts or anyone else. I think you'll find what I have to say is relevant to your situation." Then he named a number, a dollar figure with 8 digits in it. He said, "That's what I'm prepared to offer for you to walk away from what you found today and let me handle the rest. No lawyers, no complications, no federal involvement. You pay off your bank note. You keep the farm. Clean and done." Earl looked at the coin on the table, at the bank letter beneath it, through the kitchen window at Claire standing in the gravel with her arms folded against the cold, watching the house. He thought about Thomas Dawson farming above those rooms for 40 years. About his grandfather William, who had opened one chest and locked it back up and kept the north field in hay and never told anyone. About his father James, steering around the soft spots without explanation. About every generation of Dawson men carrying something they couldn't name because the name had never been passed down. "Do what I could not. Whatever that means to you," he said, into the phone. "Who are you?" The man said he'd be in touch. Then the line went quiet. Earl set the handset down on the table beside the coin. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, alone, in the particular silence that follows a conversation that has changed the shape of a situation you were already trying to understand. Earl set the kitchen handset down and stood at the table for a moment, looking at the gold coin on top of the bank letter. The house was quiet around him the way houses get in the space between one thing ending and another thing beginning. Outside, he could hear gravel shifting under feet, Claire's voice and Daniel's voice, his grandchildren asking questions about the farm the way kids do when they've arrived somewhere they don't know well. Normal sounds. The ordinary sounds of a family pulling up after a long drive and taking in where they'd arrived. He picked up the coin and turned it over once. He put it in his shirt pocket. Then he opened the back door and went outside. Claire was standing in the gravel with her arms crossed, not against the cold so much as against the waiting. She was 41 years old, and she had Margaret's coloring and her father's directness, which meant she looked at people when she talked to them and expected to be looked at in return. She looked at Earl now. She looked at Garrett, who was leaning against his own truck with the patience of a man who knows he's in the middle of someone else's moment. "Dad," she said again, "tell me what's happening." If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Earl told her to send the kids inside and let Daniel get them settled. Daniel, a steady man who had married into this family with his eyes open and had never once pretended farming was simpler than it was, nodded at Earl and took the kids through the back door without being asked twice. Garrett said he'd be in touch and climbed into his truck and drove back down the lane. Earl and Claire stood in the gravel in the late afternoon gray, and he told her everything, start to finish, the same way he'd told Garrett that morning, except that telling Claire was different because Garrett was a professional connection and Claire was his daughter and the last living piece of Margaret. He watched her face while he talked. She didn't interrupt. She'd inherited that from Margaret too, the ability to hold a listen until a person was completely done. When he finished, she was quiet for a full minute. He'd expected argument, or the particular kind of cautious skepticism she applied to things that seemed too large to be real. He'd half expected her to say they should call someone, some official person, someone who dealt with situations that didn't fit ordinary categories. What he got instead was the question she asked, which told him something about who his daughter was, something he'd always known but was glad to be reminded of. She said, "Show me." He said, "Tomorrow. It'll be dark down there before long, and I want a lawyer present when we go back in." She accepted that the way she accepted most things Earl said with a reason attached, not enthusiastically, but without resistance. They went inside, and he put on a second pot of coffee, and she helped him make a meal out of what was in the refrigerator, which wasn't much, cold cuts and bread and cheese, and Daniel sat at the kitchen table and listened while Earl walked back through the story with more detail now. The journals, the letter, Thomas Dawson's handwriting on the map in the counting room, the coin trays in the sea chests and the gold bars in their canvas wrapping and the small wooden box with 7 keys laid out on flannel, the red-covered personal journal and the entry about planting Timothy in 1896, and the entry about Edward walking the field at age 9, feeling something underfoot. Daniel, who said less than he thought and thought more than most people gave him credit for, said, "What does the ground feel like up there now?" "Same as it always did," Earl told him. "A little soft near the hickory line." The grandchildren ate and went to bed. After Daniel went up, Claire sat across from her father at the kitchen table where the bank letter still lay, the gold coin beside it. She picked up the coin and looked at it for a long time. She turned it. She read the date. She held it at different angles under the kitchen light, as if better light might change what she was looking at. "You know what this means for the farm?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. And you're not going to sell?" "No." She set the coin down. She looked at the bank letter and then at her father. She said, quietly, "I should never have pushed you to sell. That's all I want to say about that." Earl looked at his coffee cup. "You were trying to help. I was trying to solve a math problem." She shook her head slowly. "It's not a math problem." "No, it never was." They sat in the kitchen for another hour. He told her about the phone call, about the man who had not given his name and had offered 8 figures to walk away. She went very still when he told her that. "Someone knew," she said. "Someone suspected," he said. "There's a difference." He told her what Garrett had said about the Louisville records, about the lost-in-transit classifications, about the trail that a determined researcher could follow from 19th-century federal archives to a county deed in Kentucky. The gold didn't vanish without a paper record. The paper record just got old and bureaucratic and buried under 130 years of subsequent administration, and someone had been doing the digging. She thought about this with the focused quiet she brought to problems that mattered. "Then, what do we do about him?" "Get a lawyer in the room first," Earl said. "That's what we do first about everything." In the morning, he called the number Garrett had given him before leaving. The lawyer's name was Marcus Webb, and he answered before the second ring with the alert manner of someone who'd been waiting for the call. Garrett had apparently phoned ahead, because Webb already knew the broad outlines and asked 4 precise questions in the first 2 minutes. When the property was acquired by the family, whether there was any gap in the chain of title, whether Earl had made any representation to a third party about the discovery, and whether the contents of the underground space had been moved or disturbed. Earl answered all 4. Webb said he'd be there by noon. He was there by 11:30, driving a pale blue sedan with a Fayette County plate. A compact man in his mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair and the measured manner of someone who had spent 30 years getting complicated situations into the light without letting them catch fire in transit. He shook Earl's hand, shook Claire's, accepted a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and worked through another hour of questions before he said anything that could be called an assessment. "What you're describing," he finally said, "has 2 distinct legal tracks that are going to run parallel for a while and eventually converge. The first is ownership. What does Kentucky property law say about material discovered beneath land that has been in continuous family possession since 1891, material that has never been claimed, listed, or encumbered in any title search or deed record, and for which the original possessor left documentation establishing clear intent for the land's heirs?" He paused. "That track favors you. Strongly. The second track is federal. What does Treasury say about a same material that was classified as lost in transit in 1893 and has been sitting on private land since?" That track is more complicated, but not hopeless. The statute of limitations on federal property recovery for something classified as lost rather than stolen is a different animal than you might expect, and the documentation Thomas Dawson left changes the picture considerably. Earl said, "How considerable?" Webb looked at his notes. If the assay records show the consignments were classified as clerical losses rather than theft, and if the family can demonstrate continuous, unwitting possession, there are precedents, not many, but there are precedents, for negotiated settlements that leave the majority with the landowner. The federal government in these situations often cares more about historical documentation and proper accounting than about recovering the full value of 130-year-old gold. He looked up. What I don't want is for anyone to approach this informally. Not the anonymous caller, not any expert Garrett brings in without my involvement, not any federal agency you decide to contact on your own. Everything goes through me. Earl agreed. Claire agreed. The phone call from the anonymous man was the first order of business. Webb made a call that afternoon. He had resources that Earl didn't have, which was the point of a lawyer, and within 4 hours he had a name. The man who had called Earl the previous evening was a private collector from Cincinnati named Harlan Vest, 63 years old, who had spent 15 years researching the Louisville assay office's missing consignments of 1893. He was not connected to any government agency. He was not dangerous in any physical sense. He was a man with money and patience and a very specific obsession, and he had traced the trail of one particular cluster of lost-in-transit records to Bledsoe County, Kentucky, and from there to the Dawson farm deed. And he had been watching the property from the county road on and off for 2 years, waiting for something to happen. The tractor going through the north field ceiling on a Tuesday morning had been exactly the something he'd been waiting for. Webb sent Vest a letter that was polite and absolute in equal measure. Any further contact with the Dawson family would be handled exclusively through counsel. Any claim Vest believed he had to the contents of the Dawson property through some theory of finder's rights or research investment was without legal basis and would be treated accordingly. The 8-figure offer was declined. Vest did not respond to the letter directly. He sent a note through his own attorney that said, simply, that he understood the situation and would not make further contact. Webb said that was the end of it. Earl thought about Harlan Vest occasionally in the weeks that followed. A man who had spent 15 years tracing something through old federal archives, who had narrowed it to a county, and then to a property, and then to the specific stretch of the county road where you could see the Northfield skyline if you parked at the right angle. 15 years of patient research, and then a farmer's tractor had broken through a ceiling on a Tuesday morning, and the question that had occupied Vest for a decade and a half had resolved itself without him. Earl felt something close to sympathy for that. Not guilt. The gold was not Vest's, and the offer he'd made had been an attempt to take advantage of a situation, and Earl owed him nothing. But sympathy, yes. For the specific disappointment of 15 years pointing at the right answer, and then arriving too late to do anything with it. He thought Harlan Vest was probably still researching something. Men like that usually were. The next step was documentation. Webb brought in an assessor from the University of Kentucky's Historical Properties Division, a woman named Dr. and Colbert who specialized in 19th-century American numismatic history and had done prior work for the Treasury Department on recovered historical collections. She arrived the following morning with 2 graduate students and 4 cases of equipment and descended into the underground space with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting her whole career for a job of this specific type. Earl and Claire took them down. Garrett came back for this as well, standing to one side of the counting room, while Dr. Colbert moved through the space with a quiet that matched the place. She examined the walls first, the dry-laid stone, running gloved fingers along the joints. She looked at the ceiling timbers. She looked at the floor. She read the map on the wall for a long time, making notes. She did not touch the ledgers without asking Earl's permission first, and when he gave it she handled them with the care of a person who understood that old documents were not just old documents. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She worked through the primary storage room first, taking inventory of the coin jars, removing samples carefully for analysis. Then the corridor, the iron-strapped crates, the bullion bars. She held one bar for a long time, reading its stamps, and Earl watched her expression stay controlled with the deliberate effort of a professional who has decided that the time for showing feeling is later, when the work is done. She said, without looking up from the bar, "Are you aware that the Louisville assay office produced fewer than 300 stamped bars in 1891 before a fire destroyed their equipment and forced a 6-month shutdown?" He said he wasn't. She said, The bars that were produced in that year are among the rarest surviving examples of Louisville assay work. Collectors have been looking for them for decades. Individual bars have sold at specialized auction for 6 to 8 times their gold content value when authenticated examples have appeared. She set the bar gently back in its canvas. She didn't say anything else about it. She didn't need to. The counting room took the better part of 2 days to properly document. The coin trays were cataloged individually, each coin photographed and noted, dates and conditions logged in a system Dr. Colbert's students worked through with portable equipment. The process was slow and meticulous, and Earl found himself respecting it the way he respected any work that required real attention. The students were young, and they knew what they were doing, and they handled each tray as though it contained something irreplaceable, which in several cases it did. The sea chests were inventoried fully. The personal items from chest 6 were handled with particular care. The pocket watch turned out, under Dr. Colbert's examination, to carry an inscription on the inside of the case, to W. A. Harmon, Director, Louisville Assay Office, in recognition of service. William Harmon had been the first director of the Louisville office, appointed in 1882, the same year Thomas Dawson had begun his work there. How a watch given to Harmon had ended up in Thomas Dawson's possession was a question the records room ledgers didn't answer directly, though there was one entry from 1896 that referenced a private transaction with the Harmon estate after the director's death. Thomas had bought it. He'd logged the purchase, because Thomas Dawson logged everything. On the evening of the second day, Dr. Colbert came up from the underground space and sat at Earl's kitchen table with her preliminary summary. She was a measured person by nature, not given to theatrics, and she laid out the numbers the way a doctor delivers a serious diagnosis, clearly, directly, without softening and without sensationalism. She said she wanted to give him a preliminary range before the full authentication process was complete. Then she said the range, the lower end of it. Earl's daughter made a sound he had never heard her make before, a short exhaled breath that was not quite a word. The lower end, she said. That's a floor, Dr. Colbert confirmed. Before the premium valuation on the 1891 bars, which are in exceptional condition due to the stable underground environment. Before the numismatic value of the proof quality coin, some of which appear to be date-year combinations that are exceptionally rare in uncirculated condition. Before the historical significance premium that applies to a documented collection of this provenance. She paused. The value of what's in those rooms will be significantly higher than what I've given you. The number on that tablet is where we start. Earl looked at the number. The lower end of Dr. Colbert's range was approximately $43 million in metal content alone. He thought about the bank letter, which was still on the kitchen table, to the right of his coffee cup. He thought about 60 days. He thought about 3 years of watching the margins shrink, of letting go of the 2 hands he couldn't afford, of patching the equipment shed roof with sheet metal and a prayer. He thought about Thomas Dawson farming above these rooms for 40 years, planting Timothy hay and steering around the soft spots, and writing in his private journal that the ground was better than it looked. The full assessment took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Earl kept working the farm. He fixed the fuel pump on the truck, finally. He replaced the fence staples on the east pasture that had been loose for 2 seasons. He fixed the kitchen light. He did all of it with the particular attention that comes when you're not doing things because you have to, but because you want to, because the work itself has value beyond its necessity, because keeping a thing maintained is a form of respect for the thing. He'd always known that. He'd just been too tired to feel it clearly. Claire stayed for the first week and then drove back to Nashville to get the kids back in school, promising to return on the weekends. She called every evening. The conversations were different now than they had been. The weight of the previous months lifted out of them, replaced with something that hadn't been there before. She asked about the farm the way she'd asked about it as a child, wanting the specific details. What had he planted? How were the cattle doing? What did the north field look like now that there was a hole in it? She wasn't asking out of obligation. She was asking because she wanted to know. At the end of the 3rd week, Dr. Colbert delivered her full report. Webb received it first, reviewed it, and then brought it to Earl's kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon. He laid it in front of Earl without comment and waited. The collection's total assessed value, combining metal content at current market, numismatic premium for the proof quality coin inventory, historical significance premium for the documented Louisville assay bars, and artifact value for the personal items from chest 6, which turned out to include a pocket watch that had belonged to the first director of the Louisville assay office. A provenance item of considerable collector significance came to $214 million. Earl read the number twice. He was aware of his own breathing. Webb said, "That's the assessed value before any federal settlement is negotiated. The number you actually receive will depend on what Treasury agrees to." "How long does the negotiation take?" "Anywhere from 3 months to 2 years, Webb said. "In this case, I believe it will be on the shorter end. Here's why." He opened his own folder and laid out the key argument. Thomas Dawson's ledgers were not the records of a man who stole government gold. They were the records of a government employee who made an unauthorized decision to hold certain consignments during a period of institutional collapse, documented every piece meticulously, and spent the rest of his life unable to undo that decision. The material was never sold, never dispersed, never used for personal gain. It sat exactly where he put it, accounted for to the last troy ounce, for 130 years. He paused. The Treasury Department's Historical Division is staffed by people who care about American history. They also care about their budget. A negotiated settlement costs considerably less than litigation, and the legal foundation for a full recovery claim, given the statute of limitations arguments and the unwitting possession documentation, is not as strong as the government would prefer. He looked at Earl. "My estimate is 75% to the family after federal settlement." Earl did the math. $160 million, he said. "Approximately," Webb said. "After my fees and Dr. Colbert's assessment costs and related expenses, somewhat less. Still considerably more than anything that could reasonably be described as anything other than extraordinary." The negotiation with the Treasury Department's Historical Recovery Division took 14 weeks, which Webb said was among the fastest resolutions he'd seen for a matter of this complexity. The federal team assigned to the case was a 3-person unit out of Washington that spent 2 weeks at the farm reviewing the ledgers, the documentation, and the property's chain of title going back to 1891. They were professional, thorough, and not unfriendly. The lead negotiator, a woman named Patricia Oakes who had spent 20 years in federal historical recovery, told Earl on her second visit that Thomas Dawson's ledgers were the most complete documentation of a field agent's activity she had encountered in her career. "He was a careful man," Earl said. She said, "He was terrified and careful, which is different. A man who's just careful keeps records because it's the right thing to do. A man who's terrified and careful keeps records because he's convinced himself that the record is what stands between him and disaster." She gestured toward the ledger open on the table between them. Every entry precise to the 100th of a troy ounce. Every source double-documented. Every date verified against an external reference. He knew that if this was ever found, the record was what would determine how it was understood. Was he right? Earl asked. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "He was right." On her third visit, Patricia Oakes brought a colleague from the National Archives in Washington, a historian who specialized in the Bureau of the Mint's regional offices in the late 19th century. The historian spent an entire day in the records room with the ledgers and came out that evening with the particular look of a man who has found something he'd been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. He told Earl that the consignments described in Thomas Dawson's ledgers matched exactly, amount for amount, date for date, the entries in the Louisville Bureau's own records that had been classified as unresolved in the chaos of the 1893 panic and subsequently written off as clerical losses. Not theft, not embezzlement. Loss. There was a difference in the record that mattered. An employee suspected of theft faced criminal liability that passed to heirs and complicated civil settlement enormously. A loss was an administrative failure with no designated culprit. After 130 years, with the employing institution dissolved, the criminal liability question had collapsed under the weight of time. Thomas Dawson had been very lucky in how his situation had been classified. Whether that luck was accidental or whether he had somehow managed to influence how the records read from inside the Bureau. In those chaotic months of 1893, when he still had access, no one could say. But the historian looked at Earl with a certain professional admiration and said, "Your great-grandfather understood bureaucracy. He understood it very well." What he meant, which Earl understood later when he'd had time to think about it, was that Thomas Dawson had not just hidden gold. He had managed the paper trail at both ends, on the ground and on the record, and had done it well enough that 130 years had not unraveled it. That was not the work of a simple farmer who had made a panicked decision. That was the work of someone who understood how institutions functioned and where they were vulnerable and how to leave a situation without leaving a signature. It made Earl reconsider his image of Thomas Dawson in that photograph, the man with the beard and the direct expression standing in front of the barn. He'd read it as satisfaction. He still thought that was right. But now he understood what was beneath the satisfaction. Not the ease of a man with nothing to hide. The specific, hard-won calm of a man who had built something that would hold. The settlement, when it was reached, gave the Dawson family 78% of the collection's assessed value, a percentage slightly better than Webb had estimated. The federal government retained legal title to the historical designation of the material, which meant that the Louisville assay bars would be permanently classified as significant national heritage artifacts, a classification that in practical terms increased their individual value on the collector market considerably. The family's portion of the final assessed value, $214 million, came to just over $167 million after federal share and settlement costs. Earl also understood what would happen to the federal share. A portion would go to a National Archive fund. A portion would be used to fund an exhibit at the Smithsonian documenting the history of the Louisville Assay Office and the financial crisis of 1893, an exhibit that would include a section specifically about Thomas Dawson, his role, and the underground space he had built on his Kentucky farm. Patricia Oakes told Earl about that last part on the phone. She said she thought he should know. He thanked her and was quiet for a moment and then thanked her again. Webb called the settlement uncommon, not in scale, but in its cleanness. Cases like this tended to drag, he said. The documentation, Thomas's ledgers and the records room full of 47 years of entries, had made it harder for either side to find ambiguity to fight over. There was no gap in what Thomas had held, no discrepancy between the federal records and his own. He had been, in the end, a perfect keeper of the very thing that implicated him. That was either deeply ironic or entirely fitting, depending on how you chose to read a man who had spent 40 years living on top of the evidence of what he'd done and had never spent a dollar of it. Earl chose to read it as fitting. He also understood what would happen to the federal share. A portion would go to a National Archive fund. A portion would be used to fund an exhibit at the Smithsonian documenting the history of the Louisville Assay Office and the financial crisis of 1893, an exhibit that would include a section specifically about Thomas Dawson, his role, and the underground space he had built on his Kentucky farm. Patricia Oakes told Earl about that last part on the phone. She said she thought he should know. He thanked her and was quiet for a moment and then thanked her again. On the morning the settlement was finalized, Earl drove to First Agricultural Bank of Hardin County and paid off the operating loan in full. The loan officer who had sent the letter, a young man named Gary Perkins who had been doing his job correctly and had felt bad about doing it, looked at the wire transfer confirmation on his computer screen and then looked at Earl and then looked at the screen again. "You're sure about this, Mr. Dawson?" Earl said he was sure. Gary Perkins said, with genuine feeling, "I'm glad, Mr. Dawson." He didn't ask any other questions. He was a young man who understood that some things were not his business. Earl drove home on county roads he'd driven 10,000 times and watched the fields on either side with an attention that was different from before, not urgent, not the constant assessment of a man who is calculating what he can afford and what he can't. Just looking. The bottomland this time of year was brown and quiet, dormant in the way that land goes dormant in late November, not absent, but resting. He'd worked it for 30 years, and he'd work it for as long as he was able, not because he had to now, but because it was what his hands knew how to do and what made the mornings make sense. A man who farms because he has to is enduring. A man who farms because he chooses to is something else. He was figuring out what that felt like. He called Claire from the driveway before he went inside. She picked up immediately. "It's done," he said. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "How do you feel?" He thought about it. He said, "Like I can go to the North Field tomorrow without thinking about the bank." "That's a good answer," she said. The farm improvements took most of the winter. The equipment shed roof came first, a proper job done by a crew from Hardin that took a week and left it solid for the foreseeable future. The east pasture fence was replaced entirely, new posts and new wire run cleanly from corner to corner. A new tractor arrived in December, a newer model than the one that had gone through the Northfield ceiling, and Earl spent a week getting acquainted with it the way you get acquainted with any machine you're going to trust your work to. He didn't love it yet. He thought he probably would in a season or two. He had made decisions about what to do with the rest of the money over the weeks of the settlement process, talking them through with Claire and with Webb and with Garrett, who had been paid a finder's consultant fee that made him genuinely uncomfortable and which Earl had insisted on. The farm itself would be improved properly, the equipment shed roof replaced with something that would last, the east pasture fencing redone from scratch, a new tractor to replace the one that had gone through the Northfield ceiling and sat tilted at its angle until a rigging company had come and pulled it out in the second week of the assessment process. The tractor was not salvageable. Earl had bought a new one without the particular joy he'd expected, because it turned out that a machine you'd bought and maintained and fought with for 15 years was harder to replace than a machine that was simply better. He set up an agricultural education scholarship in Margaret's name at the University of Kentucky, funded in perpetuity from an endowment. He hadn't talked to Claire about that one first. When he told her, she was quiet on the phone for a long time. Then she said that was exactly right. He donated a sum to the Bledsoe County Historical Society for the restoration of the county courthouse records archive, which had been deteriorating for a decade without the funding to address it. The records there included Thomas Dawson's original property deed from 1891. It seemed right that the deed should be preserved properly. He also set aside a portion to hire 2 permanent hands for the farm, not just seasonal help, but people with steady wages and real stakes in the place, which was what the farm had needed for years and what he'd been unable to provide. He thought Thomas Dawson would have understood that decision. A farm without enough hands was a farm that wore down its keeper. He'd been wearing down for a long time. He was done with that. Garrett Cole, for his part, handled the sale of 2 items from the collection through specialist auction channels after the settlement. The pocket watch that had belonged to the Louisville Assay Office's first director, and a single proof quality 1893 Double Eagle that was determined to be the only known surviving uncirculated example of that date and mint combination. The watch sold to a private collector for considerably more than Earl had expected. The coin sold at auction in New York for a number that briefly appeared in the national financial news. Earl did not attend the auction. He watched a clip of it on his phone, sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning before work, and then he put the phone down and went out to the barn. The exhibit at the Smithsonian opened in March, 7 months after the settlement was finalized. It was called The Keeper's Accounting: Gold, Crisis, and a Century of Silence. Earl and Claire flew to Washington for the opening, which he would later describe as the most uncomfortable 2 hours of his life, not because anything went wrong, but because standing in a room full of people who were interested in your family's history, while a curator explained it to them, was a peculiar kind of exposure that had nothing in common with the ordinary exposure of daily work. He appreciated what Patricia Oakes and her team had done with the material. They had been fair to Thomas Dawson in a way that Earl hadn't been certain they would be. They had not made him into a hero or a villain. They had shown him as a man of his time operating under specific pressures with specific fears and making decisions that were neither entirely defensible nor entirely condemnable. Decisions that had consequences spanning over a century and that had ultimately, through no plan of Thomas's, resolved in a way that served the historical record better than any alternative might have. The exhibit placard for the section on Thomas read, Thomas Jameson Dawson, Field Agent, Bureau of the Mint, Louisville Office, 1882 to 1896. In 1893, during the financial panic that collapsed 65 American banks in a single month, Dawson made the unauthorized decision to hold federal gold consignments on his private property in Bledsoe County, Kentucky, rather than forward them to institutions he believed would fail. He documented every item. He spent the next 40 years unable to come forward and the remaining time of his life hoping a successor would. The collection remained sealed and undisturbed for 131 years, held intact by 4 generations of his family, until October 2024, when his great-grandson Earl Dawson's tractor broke through the ceiling of the underground storage space Dawson had built on his land in 1892. Earl stood in front of that placard for a long time. He read it the way he'd read Thomas's letter in the records room, slowly, with the weight of it, letting each sentence settle before moving to the next. Around him the room was full of people historians and collectors and journalists and ordinary visitors who had come because the story had made national news and the story was the kind of story people wanted to see made real. He heard their conversations in the background, and they felt very far away. Claire stood beside him. She read the placard and then read it again, and then she put her hand through his arm the way Margaret used to do on cold days, the gesture identical, the warmth of it catching him off guard the way it still sometimes did when he saw Margaret and his daughter. She said, he would have liked knowing it ended this way. Earl thought about a man who had planted hickory trees at the north end of his field in 1892 and walked that field for 40 years and written in his private journal that the ground was better than it looked. A man who had meant to tell Edward and had written a letter to William and had died with the secret still sealed, not out of cruelty or indifference, but because fear had gotten bigger than he could manage, and then so many years had passed that the size of it had become its own kind of prison. He also thought about what the historian from the National Archives had said, your great-grandfather understood bureaucracy. He understood it very well. He thought about what it meant to be a man who understood how institutions worked, who had watched them begin to fail in 1893 and had made a judgment call about where the gold would be safer, and who had then spent 40 years in a different kind of institution, the one built from family and land and seasons, an institution that had held everything he'd entrusted to it, without failing once. He thought Thomas Dawson probably would have liked knowing it ended this way. Yes, after the Smithsonian opening, the story lived in the news for several weeks and then reseeded the way stories do. There were a few magazine profiles, a documentary inquiry from a production company that Earl politely declined, a request from a true crime podcast that he also declined. He gave one interview to a regional Kentucky newspaper because it seemed right that the local record should have it. The reporter was young and asked good questions and wrote a piece that was accurate and treated Thomas Dawson with the same care that Patricia Oakes had brought to the exhibit placard. Spring came to the Dawson farm the way it always came, slow and negotiated, the cold giving ground inch by inch from February into March, the fields going from frost-hard to soft, and then to workable over a period of weeks that required patience. Earl worked through the preparation the same way he'd worked through it every spring for 30 years, checking the ground in the mornings, waiting for the right conditions, planting when the conditions were right. He had a new tractor. The barn roof was solid. The east fence was new. The farm looked, from the road, the way a farm looks when it's been maintained with attention rather than managed with the narrow margins of survival. There was a difference in how he worked it now that he was still learning to name. Not urgency, which had been there for 3 years, the low-level constant pressure of a man doing everything himself because he couldn't afford help and couldn't afford to stop. Not the fear-adjacent vigilance that had made every equipment failure feel like a crisis because the margins were that thin. What replaced those things was harder to define, closer to what it felt like to work because the work itself mattered, because a field planted and tended and brought to harvest was a complete thing in itself regardless of what the numbers said at the end. He hired 2 hands in March, young men from the county who needed work and knew farming. He showed them the place the way his father had shown him, not by explaining everything at once, but by working alongside them and letting the land teach its own lessons. The east pasture fence had been replaced, but the gate hung slightly wrong, had always hung slightly wrong, and he showed them how to adjust it without replacing the whole hinge. The north boundary of the south field drained slowly after heavy rain, had always drained slowly, and he showed them the pattern so they'd know when to wait and when to push forward. Small things. The accumulated knowledge of a farm lived on for 30 years. The kind of knowledge that didn't come from books or instruction, but from seasons of attention and enough failures to understand why the patience mattered. One of the young men, a 23-year-old named Jake, whose family had farmed 2 counties east before losing their place in foreclosure 4 years ago, asked Earl one afternoon, while they were repairing the equipment shed door, whether the stories about the gold underground were true. Earl said they were. Jake thought about that for a moment and then said, quietly, that he hoped his family's land still had something worth finding. Earl said he hoped so too. Then they finished the door and went on to the next thing. Claire came up in April with the family for a weekend and walked the north field with Earl on a Saturday morning, the two of them moving through the new spring grass toward the hickory line. The safety fencing around the opening was still in place. The access hole had been properly reinforced with a steel surround by the structural engineer in the fall, and there was now a proper ladder in place for entry, and a proper door over the opening that locked from the outside. The underground space was no longer the secret it had been. 3 separate academic teams had been through it. A federal archivist had spent a week with the records room. The structural engineer had assessed and documented the construction, and eventually it would be open to historians by appointment as a documented historic site. But it was a Saturday morning in April, and there were no academics present. Just Earl and his daughter walking through wet spring grass toward trees that had stood there since before either of them was born. He told her about Edward that morning, about the journal entry where Thomas had walked his 9-year-old son through this field, and the boy had said the ground felt like something was underneath. About how Thomas had said maybe it does and let it rest there, and about what it must have cost him to let his son walk over that ground for the rest of his life without knowing what was below. Claire listened and didn't say anything for a while. They stood at the hickory line, the 2 largest trees in front of them with their bases together, the ones Earl's father had said Thomas planted first. She put her hand on the bark of the nearer one. It was rough and cold under her palm. She said, "He thought Edward would be the one to finish it." Yes, and when Edward didn't come home, nobody else knew enough to try. Right. She looked at the tree and then out at the field and then at her father. She said, "You were supposed to be the one. You just had to get to the right morning." He hadn't thought of it that way exactly. He thought about it now, standing in the April cold with the hickory bark under his daughter's hand and the field stretching back toward the lane. He thought about an October morning and a tractor and 5 passes of plowing before the ground finally gave way under the right wheel at the right spot. He thought about the bank letter on the kitchen table, about 60 days, about the pressure of it that had sent him to the North Field that particular morning because he needed every acre producing. Had he not been that desperate, had the bank given him 6 months more, would he have left the North Field another season? He didn't know. He suspected Thomas Dawson didn't know either. Whatever Thomas might have believed about timing and purpose and the land giving up its secret when it was ready. Some things you can plan. The rest you work toward and trust. The North Field he left alone through the spring planting season. He'd decided, and Claire had agreed, and Webb had consulted with the relevant federal parties, that the field above the underground space would remain in grass permanently, maintained but not worked, the kind of land that looks from the road like a deliberate choice rather than an oversight. No crops above the rooms. No risk of another ceiling compromised by machinery. He put Timothy hay in the south section of the North Field, away from the underground structure. The same crop his great-grandfather had put in 1896, the first spring after he'd sealed the rooms. He planted it partly because it was practical and partly because it seemed right, a small specific continuity across 130 years. On a morning in early May he drove up the lane to the North Field and parked at the edge of it and walked to the spot where the opening was, now enclosed in its steel surround with the locked door flush to the ground. He stood there and looked down at the door and then out at the hickory line, which was in full new leaf, green and restless in the spring wind. The trees moved the way established trees move, from the roots rather than the tops, the whole structure of them responding to the wind rather than just the surface. He thought about Edward Dawson, age 9, walking this field with his father and saying the ground felt like something was underneath. He thought about Thomas saying maybe it does, and letting a child's curiosity rest on that answer because the true answer was something no 9-year-old needed to carry. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the 1893 Double Eagle, not the auction coin, which was in a New York collector's vault. This one, the first one he'd taken from the jar on the first day, the coin he'd carried in his pocket when he'd climbed back up the rope and stood in the October field and understood that the ground had finally finished with its secret. He'd kept it. Webb had said he was entitled to it. Dr. Colbert had authenticated it and returned it to him in a small clear case, but he'd taken it out of the case because gold wasn't meant to be behind glass. He turned it over in his palm. The metal was warm from being against his body. The eagle on the reverse caught the May morning light and returned it cleanly, the same way it would have returned light in 1893 when it was new. Do what I could not. Whatever that means to you. Earl looked at the coin for a long moment. Then he looked at the hickory line, at the sky above the north end of the property where the morning was clear and cold with the particular cleanness of early May. He put the coin back in his pocket. He walked to the truck, and he drove back down the lane to start the morning's work. The farm was his. The debt was gone. The rooms below the North Field were sealed and documented, and properly in the care of history. His great-grandfather's name was on a placard in Washington. His wife's name was on a scholarship at the university. The kitchen light was fixed. Thomas Dawson had planted those hickories in 1892. He'd intended them as a windbreak, and they had served as one for 130 years, standing at the property line with the patient solidity of things that were well planted and left to grow. In a good year, they might stand another 100. Earl had done what he could. He thought it was probably enough. The first scholarship recipient in Margaret Dawson's name was a 20-year-old from Harlan County named Delia Pratt who wanted to study soil science. Earl found this out through a letter from the university's endowment office that arrived on a Wednesday in September, and he read it standing at the kitchen counter still in his barn coat. The letter said that Delia had been selected from 43 applicants, that she was the first in her family to attend college, and that she intended to return to eastern Kentucky after her degree to work in reclamation agriculture on former strip mine land. Earl read that last part twice. He thought Margaret would have approved of the specific ambition. Margaret had always respected people who named exactly what they were going to do and then went and did it. He wrote Delia a short note through the endowment office. He didn't say much. He said he was glad she'd been chosen and that the land out east would be better for having someone who knew how to ask it the right questions. He wasn't sure if that was the kind of thing a scholarship recipient wanted to hear from an old farmer in Bledsoe County. He sent it anyway. Claire brought the family up for the anniversary weekend. Her daughter, who was 10 now and had been asking about the underground room since the October before, wanted to go down. Earl had been expecting this request for several months and had been thinking about how to handle it. The rooms were a designated historic site now, which meant formal access required coordination with the Federal Historical Designation Team, which meant paperwork and advance notice and a process that had nothing to do with a 10-year-old's curiosity on a Saturday morning. He called Patricia Oakes on a Thursday. She called him back within the hour. She said she'd make a note and no one was going to drive from Washington to stand in a field in Kentucky over a family visit. She said to take good photographs and send them to her. So on the Saturday morning, 1 year and 2 days after the tractor had gone through the ceiling, Earl climbed down the ladder ahead of his granddaughter, whose name was Rose, and who had her mother's coloring and her grandfather's directness, and who descended the ladder with the focused concentration of someone doing something they have been thinking about for a long time. Claire came down behind her. Daniel stayed at the top with the younger one, who was 7 and had decided the ladder was not for him. Rose stood in the primary storage room with the flashlight Earl had handed her and turned it slowly around the space. The jars were gone. The crates were gone. What remained was the stone construction itself, the floor and walls, the ceiling timbers, the shelving unit against the far wall with its empty shelves. The room was a room now rather than a vault. Without the contents, it felt larger. She asked, "Is this where you found the coins?" "This is where the first ones were," Earl told her. "In jars on those shelves, and in crates stacked along that wall." She looked at the empty shelves for a moment with the particular seriousness of a child processing something she can't entirely fit into her existing understanding of the world. She said, "And your great-great-great-grandfather built this." "Great-great-grandfather? Thomas. He built all of it. Why didn't he just tell someone?" Earl had thought about how to answer this if Rose asked it. He'd had a year to think about it. He said he was afraid. By the time he wasn't afraid anymore, he'd waited so long that the waiting had become its own kind of answer. That happens to people sometimes. Rose thought about this. She was 10, which was old enough to have some experience of situations where delay becomes its own decision. She nodded slowly. They walked the corridor. They stood in the counting room, which was empty now except for the map still mounted behind its glass on the north wall. Earl had asked that the map stay. The federal team had agreed, it being built into the wall rather than portable. Rose stood in front of it and read the room labels and traced the key in the corner with one finger, not touching the glass, just following the lines of Thomas Dawson's handwriting. She looked at the name at the bottom for a long time. She said, "He signed it like it was a painting." Earl looked at the signature he'd read 100 times now and saw it the way she was seeing it for the first time. She was right. It wasn't a legal signature, not the careful, controlled mark of a man signing a document. It was looser than that, written with the ease of someone claiming something they'd made. He hadn't thought of it that way before. On the way back up the ladder, Rose stopped about halfway, one hand on the rung, and looked back down at the counting room below her with the flashlight beam playing across the stone floor and the empty circle where the chests had stood. She said, "Will it still be here when I'm old?" "The structure is sound," Earl told her. The engineer said, "Another century, easy." She looked down at it a moment longer. Then she climbed the rest of the way up. At the surface, she stood at the edge of the opening and looked out at the hickory line the way Earl had stood there 100 times in the past year. The October light was low and clear, and the hickory leaves had gone to yellow and brown, the same turn they made every year whether or not anyone was watching. She said, "I want to bring my kids here someday." Earl looked at her. She was 10 years old, and she was already thinking about her children and what she'd show them. "All right," he said. "It'll be here." Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.